Bob Trefz, so good to have you here. I've been reading your magazine Freedom's Ring for some time now, and I want to tell you that God has raised you up, brother, for such a time as this. I know you have a lot to tell us, and before we get into it, let's ask God's Holy Spirit to be with us, because I want to tell you, from what I have already heard, you have a tremendous wealth of knowledge to share with us. So let's ask God's Holy Spirit to be with us right now. Will you kneel with me? Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you will be with my brother Bob Trefz. Dear Father, I thank you for raising him up for such a critical time as this in the Seventh Adventist Church. Touch his lips with a hot coal from thine altar now, dear Father, as he brings to us the revelations that he has found happening not only in the world but in the church, and how it leads to end-time prophecy. To thy name's honor and glory, we dedicate this video in the holy and blessed name of Jesus and for his sake. Amen.
Amen.
Bob, when I was on vacation recently, I took this bound volume of Freedom's Ring that you sent me, and I went through it with a highlighter pen. And I want to tell you, brother, it's been a long time since I have seen any document that has shaken me like this material that you have put together. The Lord has given you a knowledge and a insight into what is happening within our church. And what we want to do on this video is just to let you talk and to reveal to God's people the things that you have uncovered and put it on video for God's historic Adventist people to realize where we are in this church and in this earth's history. Before we get into this, though, I would like to know, and I think the Adventist people watching this video would like to know also, what your history has been. I've got to be perfectly honest with you. A year ago, I'd never heard of Bob Trefz. I didn't know who you were, and suddenly I see this Freedom's Ring everywhere and all this wonderful material and people talking about the material that you have brought out. Give us a little bit of your history. Have you been a Seventh Adventist all your life? Have you been through our educational system? How did Freedom's Ring come into existence? Give us an update. How did you get where you are now, Bob?
First of all, John, I'd like to say it's really wonderful to be with you. We've
heart.
enjoyed our experience here, and we feel that we owe you a real debt for the work that you've done with your celebration series. It has awakened the church like nothing else has, and it's a real honor to be here with you. I'm a third-generation Adventist, John, and I grew up loving the Lord, had godly parents. I spent a lot of time hiking out in nature as a boy and teenager, and I still do. I always have loved the influence of the Spirit of God coming through the Word as well as the natural world. And as a boy, I was keenly aware about the Second Advent. I had a picture of it in my bedroom, and I remember even praying to the Lord that the Lord would somehow give me a dream of what it might be like at the Second Advent. And I was keenly aware also about end-time events. I suppose it was about at the age of 11 that I picked up the Great Controversy, not this one, but I was so astounded by what I read. It gripped my heart like I think probably nothing I had ever read had gripped it. And I wondered, why am I not hearing these things in sermons? And this is absolutely fascinating, and my heart was just charmed by the story of the Reformation and Luther and the Waldenses. And ever since then, whenever I've been able to obtain old books on the subject of historical theology, I've gotten a hold of them, read them. I love Daubigny's History of the Reformation that Ellen and James White would read by the hour Sabbath afternoons. And as I went on through my educational experience in academy and then in college, I felt a deepening hungering for the Lord. And I got to the point in college where I would be spending 3 and 4 hours a day studying the Bible in the spirit of prophecy.
Amen.
I had a Honda Trail 90, and I loved to go up into the North Georgia mountains, the mountains of Tennessee, where the sparkling lakes and the rivers and waterfalls and commune with the Lord.
Now, did you go to college at Southern Missionary College?
Right.
That's where I was.
I went there as well as at Atlantic Union College.
Yes, yes.
Came through our educational system except for when I was in kindergarten and first grade, was public school.
So you were born and raised a Seventh-day Adventist and came up through our educational system just like I did. I got to ask you, how old are you, Bob?
42.
42. You beat me by 2 years. I just turned 40. So we come from the same generation. I think that's obvious.
That's right.
Both born and raised in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, what happened in your college years? You gave me a little hint of that earlier.
You know, John, that's an interesting point you make. We're both of the same generation, same vintage, and we have seen the complete turning inside out of our movement.
You can say that.
And that has concerned both of us and led us to do what we're doing. But your question was, what did I see in college that stimulated and concerned me?
Yes.
Well, in the college dorm, you could walk from one end of the dorm to the other, 400 fellows, and not miss one word of the main rock station in Chattanooga.
Oh, you found that to be true in your dorm too, huh?
It was so bad. There was a young student, a doctor's son there, who was 16 years old, and he came one day to my room and he said, "Bob, I am losing my mind here." The intense worldliness, doors open with the music just pouring through the hallways, no relief.
Right.
So I said to him, "I have the answer for you." And I said, "You come with me." And we hopped on my Trail 90, and 1 hour in the mountains, he was just fine. But it was during that time that I read the statement of the Spirit of Prophecy that the hours of sunrise and sunset are God's appointed time for meeting with the youth. And I would jump on my cycle and go out and be there when the sun rose and be up in the hills when the sun set, just worshiping God. It was the most thrilling experience. And those rides out in the mountain, it was an Enoch type of experience. I was 19 years old, and you know the ages around that. And I just reveled in the freedom and the communion with God. To me, it was the greatest thing in the world to be able to commune with the Creator.
Amen. Well, what started happening when you were in college that helped you to realize that things were not on course as far as we as a Seventh-day Adventist? You mentioned to me earlier that you started to realize that in 20 years things were going to be drastically different because our colleagues, the age group that you and I went to school with, are now in leadership positions in the church, and you realized that then, and you said in 20 years there's going to be a terrible upheaval in the Seventh-day Adventist Church because these are the church administrators being trained right now. What was that, in the 70s?
Late 60s,
early 70s. Has that been true? Was that prophetic, Bob?
Absolutely. As I looked around me, I knew there was a titanic struggle. And John, this issue goes far beyond just theology, which is very critical. It goes into the very core of our experience. With the fear of the Lord, are we going to surrender and submit to the Lord, or are we going to imbibe of these things? Yes. And as I looked around, I said to myself, in 20 years, we're going to see upheavals in this church like you wouldn't believe.
You said earlier, I appreciate so much, Bob, your honesty and forthrightness. And you admitted to me, you said, John, I've got to be honest and truthful with you, that I got caught up in the Ford heresy. Tell us about that.
Well, after I did a stint in Africa under the Adventist Volunteer Service Corps, teaching college and academy, right out of the Bible, incidentally, in the Spirit of Prophecy. It was a tremendous experience. And I had a good, excellent Bible teacher in college who comprehended the great controversy issues. That was very meaningful to me. And I came back and I attended the seminary. I was very shocked by the ecumenical stance of the seminary. I will say this, there are some good men there, but the overall cast is an ecumenical type of cast and network.
I found the same thing to be true
and
in my theological training.
It was very disturbing. Yes. There is, of course, new theology being taught there. We know that 2020 vision now is being used.
Yes.
And whole departments are in that category.
How did you get sucked up into this Ford thing, though, Bob?
What happened was, after 5 quarters at the seminary, I went to my wife and I.
This is Andrews, yeah.
Right. I knew I had to answer some of these questions. Even after having studied the Spirit of Prophecy in the Bible for hours, every day for years, it was so disturbing to me, the things that I encountered, that I knew I needed time to answer these questions for myself.
Was it the situation with the heavenly sanctuary, the things they were twisting concerning that? That's what I found when I was at Southern Missionary College.
It was, with me, it was it didn't jibe with the book Great Controversy. It didn't jibe with the three angels' messages. You know,
what didn't jibe? What they were saying?
The whole cast of the approach at the seminary bothered me. The approach toward Rome was very significant.
Yeah.
Here, I cut my teeth on
Great Controversy.
Great Controversy.
Amen.
And it didn't square up. It didn't square up with what I had taught. In fact, I had a class there right after I came back from Africa in which we had outright ecumenical books. One was by James F. White, New Forms of Worship, where it advocated dancing, hiring professional dancers to dance on the stage for worship.
This is at seminary at Andrews.
And recommended beyond that even having the congregations dance.
And then our people wonder why our preachers are the way they are today. And those with white hair in the Adventist church say, you know, the things we're hearing from the pulpits today don't match what we heard 30, 40 years ago, and they have a hard time understanding why there's been this big shift. It's because our ministry has been trained in ecumenicalism.
Not only that, it started long before that in the educational system, as you know,
Absolutely.
John. There was one very dedicated professor there at the seminary who sometimes had to fast for days before he approached certain subjects because of the hostility of the fellows who had been trained in our colleges. They come into this with it fastened on them early on. Anyway, in this particular class, I had to critique the book, and I said, of course, well, this man had even recommended, he said, we are past the literary era, and so we need to use banners of love and peace, and we're beyond the stage where people will read the Bible and that type of thing. So I said, of course, this man is an ecumenical, and we cannot go along with what he's saying. We have to find our principles of worship in the Word of God and the Spirit of prophecy. The professor was furious. He came into class with the sheaf of analyses that the students had done, and he built up as he was reading them, finally got to mine at the end, and he said, "Brethren, ecumenism is not a dirty word," and his face was just flushed with anger. He took excerpts from my paper and twisted them out of context. And a couple weeks later, he called me into his office, and he asked me the question. He said, "Are you an American?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Have you been a lifelong Adventist?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Are your parents Adventists?" And I said, "Yes." He's in questions like this, and finally he said to me, "I noticed you came down hard on the book we had for class." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Now, if this man was sitting here in this chair, don't you think we ought to talk to him?" Of course, meaning ecumenical,
Sure.
but I took it in a little different vein, and I said I'd be happy to talk to the man, but I said as far as his book goes, it was directly contrary to the first angel's message. And the professor's mouth metaphorically dropped open, and I got up and walked out of the office. But this is the kind of thing you encounter, you know.
This is exactly what I encountered at Southern College. Exactly. You know, I had been there my freshman year in 1970, but then I went my sophomore, junior year to La Sierra, but then I had dropped out because I had become disillusioned. But when the Lord called me distinctively into the ministry and I went back to Southern College in 1979, this is exactly what I found at Southern College. And I would find myself at odds with my entire theology class and professor, defending 1844, Day for a Year, the Heavenly Sanctuary, Character Perfection, Ellen White, our cardinal doctrines. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe the things that were happening. And to find out that the same exact thing happened to you in our colleges.
Well, John, I took a break then and went and worked with my dad's medical practice, giving Bible studies. We remodeled a number of houses for finances. We were on deferred appointment to Africa. And the conference ultimately offered me a district, but at that time I needed to go back and finish up my MDiv. And I ultimately went on for my MTH and basically took the bulk of the classwork was doctoral work. And about the time I began my thesis for the MTH, I went back in the field, and I've been so busy ever since. And I was a college teacher. But in that break, at the end...
You were a college teacher. So you've also taught on the college level too.
Oh yes, in fact I taught virtually every undergraduate course that is usually taught, including some that aren't usually taught, like Biblical Aramaic.
how did you get to the mindset where you are today? How did you get in the groove of historic Adventism and come out of all of this stuff? That's what people ask me. John, how did you go through our educational system and get to where you are today? And I want to ask you that question now.
Well, I knew it would be a battle at the seminary, and particularly after our first stint. When we went back the second time, I guarded, first of all, very carefully the communion with God. I had prayer walks in the morning, in the evening. I took my family for prayer walks morning and evening. There were families breaking up around us. There were faculty families breaking up. There were fellows selling their Spirit of Prophecy books, leaving the ministry, leaving the faith, all of that type of thing. So, and I devoted a certain segment of each day specifically for answering the questions that had arisen in my own mind as a result of doubts that had been raised in classes. I had one class that was so subtly satanic that I had to spend 2 hours each time after that class, after virtually every class period, in communion with the Lord to get rid of the evil spirit that haunted me after being in that class.
Sometimes in my classes at Southern College, I would find myself weeping because I found my theology being rearranged, and I found my mind being rearranged and twisted by, trying to take on one student, trying to take on the entire theology class and professors. That's awesome, Bob. Yet I found that day after day after day, and it got to the place where I didn't want to go to class anymore because I found out that defending historic Adventism made me an outcast. But I realized that the Lord, Bob, was preparing me for this time now.
When you look back, you can see it.
The Lord, if I couldn't have taken the onslaught that I got at Southern College as a student there, I could not withstand the persecution and revilement that I'm taking now in this independent ministry. So the Lord was preparing us. Praise His name.
But you asked specifically, John, about how did I get into this groove?
Yes.
And about the end of the time when we had taken the break, just before I went back to the seminary to continue my studies, we began getting Ford tapes. Ford had just come here from Australia to PUC. And he was saying that justification is the third angel's message in verity. It's exactly what Ellen White says. And he's a very engaging personality, very humble in his appearance and all. And I suppose I listened to about 8 different sermons as I was working, remodeling houses.
He's clever, Bob.
And
he's clever.
When we came back to the seminary, the Fordite movement was in full swing there. And there were many Australian students, many American students, lawyers, others who were entering the ministry.
Brilliant people, brightest light.
Very keen.
Yes.
And these were our predominant friends. We ate in their homes. They ate in our home. We had fellowship, and we had many experiences together. But that fall, I went back to school in the summertime, but that fall, I received the Pacific Union College forum tape in which Ford began exposing what his real position was on the sanctuary. And that was what really began triggering things in my experience then. I knew something horrendously was wrong. It didn't jibe with great controversy. It didn't jibe with our historic Adventist position on the sanctuary. I began getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, night after night, reading Leviticus 16 in Hebrew, Daniel 8 in Hebrew, Hebrews 8 through 10 in Greek, wrestling with it. I remember one time I went on a walk and I said, Lord, give me light on this. And so I not only began researching that subject in depth, but I began studying one subject after another of Ford's entire theological package. I studied his issue on the nature of sin, his doctrine, compared it with Ellen White and the Scriptures, the nature of Christ, the issue of obedience, justification, sanctification, Sabbath, sanctuary, how the whole package fit together. And I came to the conclusion that there were 2 systems of theology struggling for the mastery in a life and death combat in our structure. And during this time, that fall, I was in the Fordite movement. I was the acting treasurer, and at Christmas time they put my name up to be president of the organization. And I declined because I had had enough doubts at that point as to where it was going. And I told them I don't know enough about where this movement is going. I did further research, and I came to the point about February, it must have been, of the next year.
What year was that?
That would have been 81. No, sorry, that would have been 80. I came to the point that it was not of the Lord. In fact, even the justification concepts were forensic-only justification instead of the kind of concept we see in First Selected Messages 366.
It's fascinating to note that this was taking place in 1980, because in 79 and 80 is when the Lord was pulling me as a brand from the burning into a particular ministry that he had for me. And that's exactly, it looks, the time that God was pulling you as a brand from the burning out of another lifestyle, out of another movement, into the work that he had for you to do. A Saul on the road to Damascus experience in preparation for what he really had for you to do at that time of 1980. That's when it was happening in my life too. That's exciting, Bob, to realize.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize, John, that the fellows that were in this movement were determined to take over this church.
Oh, absolutely.
Their philosophy and their theology was, we are going to stay in this church and take it over.
From the inside.
The way the organization functioned on the campus, there was a hardcore group of those who could be trusted. And we had, for instance, one time I remember a missionary came through who had been let go in the Far East for his doctrinal positions. He presented an 8-phase, or rather 8 areas in which the new theology needed to take over the church. He went on afterwards to get his doctorate, and now he's teaching at the seminary. He was taken in immediately after completion of his doctorate, and significant things have happened since he has been back there. But then they would hold big meetings where a professor who was in secret sympathy with this movement would speak, but the general public didn't realize it. And during the meeting, the place would be packed. He'd be a popular, eloquent speaker. The leaders of the movement would watch the audience carefully, and anyone that they noted that was paying particularly close attention, they would corner them on the way out and seek to draw them into the group. I came to the point when I was convinced, and I saw clearly, of the two systems of theology struggling for the mastery, and that this was a false movement. I went in, I took to a committee meeting, and I took my materials and I handed them over, and I said, this movement is going nowhere, and it is not the movement that we are called to give. And their mouths dropped open. I got up and walked out. That summer, Glacier View took place, and at Glacier View, you know what happened there.
Yes.
Men came in from all over the world at great expense.
Yes.
Ford had spent 6 months preparing a 999-page document that gathered virtually every argument from history and current thought against the sanctuary that could be mustered at church expense.
Yes.
And at that point in 1981, his sanctuary position was condemned. I might say that Ford got his doctorate at the University of Manchester. His major professor was F.F. Bruce, who was a Plymouth Brethren, once saved, always saved individual.
Yes.
And the Antiochus Epiphanes was seen as the Antichrist, in that dissertation.
We studied Bruce when I was in college too. I remember one theology class that I had where they were just bringing in all of these theologians, and I raised such a stink. I said, why are we going to these men? Why are we learning from these men? And exactly the same situation that happened with you happened with me, where the professor's face flushed red, and he just became indignant that one of the theology students would question what he was doing in the books that he was using.
Yeah, it's amazing. And go ahead, John.
Okay, Bob, I've just got 2 questions. How did you start publishing Freedom's Ring, and what are all these books? I mean, they haven't even seen these on videos, but folks, over here on 2 tables are books. I mean, books and books and books. And I want to know what you have found in your research. We can take a little bit more time to cap off your history and to bring you into the arena of where you're publishing Freedom's Ring now. But I want to show these books and the material and how it relates to us as Seventh-day Adventists today. So bring us up to speed now to where you are in publishing Freedom's Ring, how you got to this place.
While I was teaching college, I've always loved religious liberty. One of my ancestors was William Penn. We had Huguenot ancestors. It's in my blood, and ever since college days, I have been interested in religious liberty, and so I began studying it. I began realizing that I had to give an answer myself at the end of time, personally, and give an account for where I stood on these issues. And I knew I couldn't leave that research up to anyone else. I began buying constitutional law books. I began speaking and writing on the subject, and various ones began encouraging me strongly to start up a paper. Actually, I'd wanted to do that for years, and finally we launched Freedom's Ring, and I do research, writing, editing. Now I love it. It's tremendous.
Well, I tell you, I was sure edified by this bound volume of Freedom's Ring that you sent me before I went on vacation. Was able to spend some time just going through it page by page. I want to find out what is the first inclination that you had of us heading toward Catholicism? Was it in college? When did you come to realize that a major move was underway to get the Adventist Church into the ecumenical movement and embracing Catholicism? Because that is basically what you have covered in page after page after page here, and it's in such depth that I'm wondering, how long have you been aware of this? How long have you been working on this? How long has it been since God has been revealing this to your mind? Because many laymen today, and myself included, realize that this is happening. When did you start getting wind of this?
First of all, John, I want to give all the glory to God, because there are times when God has led me in a bookstore to a certain page as I've opened the book, and I have said to myself, I've got to buy this book just for that one sentence. Yeah. Well, the question is, how did I begin to become aware of Catholicism? I'd like to show you a book here, John.
Show us these books that you've got, Bob. We're gonna have to bring a camera over here a little bit and show these viewers the close-up of this. But this is a tremendous amount. I mean, you've got hundreds of dollars right here just in books.
This is just a fraction
this
of them,
is just and when you came to speak here at Rolling Hills last Sabbath, it was so funny. You brought one big case of books in, then somebody was following, I think, your son with another big case of books, and then another big case of books, and I said, I thought I carried around a lot of books. This is phenomenal material. Let's just start in, and you start showing us book by book, page by page, the things that you have found.
Well, John, just as we were starting to launch Freedom's Ring, I walked into a bookstore, and there was this book, The Keys of This Blood, The Struggle for World Dominion between
Malachi Martin,
John Paul II, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the capitalist West. And I instantly knew that was a significant book. In fact, the first issue of Freedom's Ring dealt with just a quick synopsis of this book. And I immediately recognized that this was completely the flip side of the coin of great controversy, what Ellen White says in the chapter, Liberty of Conscience Threatened. Actually, I should back up just a little bit here, John. We had started a study group in which we were studying the celebration issue. Mm-hmm. And we had been studying out of modern revivals and the great controversy, showing that this Pentecostalism was the foretold false revival that is seeking to blunt the true. And John, really, what I see happening right now in the church is a titanic spiritual struggle of the Lord trying to bring about the revival of primitive godliness.
Amen.
And certain agencies under the influence of Christ's adversary doing everything possible to block it. But the connection with the papacy came much more clearly. I noticed that Malachi Martin tells of how the papacy was involved in bringing down the Iron Curtain, in the swift developments that took place in Eastern Europe with the demise of communism there. I had also been speaking, John, about Penny Lernoul's book, The People of God, The Struggle for World Catholicism. And in this book, Penny Lernoul, who is a liberal Catholic writer and worker in South America and Inter-America, tells of how John Paul II is wanting to take the entire world back to the way it was before the Protestant Reformation. It's a movement called Reconstructionism. And it is a movement that involves integralism, which means integrating all of life under the domination of the papacy. And so I was aware of some of these developments that were taking place. In Malachi Martin's book, he discusses in a chapter there the picture of John Paul II contemplating the world scene and categorizing each ideological entity that he is having to overcome in his drive for global domination over every individual, over every nation, over every religion, over everything in the world. And in one compartment, in one room, he classifies the minimalists, and Seventh-day Adventism appears right there. It's right in the book. And the position of John Paul II, according to Malachi Martin, as he surveys the Seventh-day Adventists and people in that category, the minimalists are people who don't believe that they will ever have a majority of the human population on their side. He says that the Seventh-day Adventists, the minimalists, are going to have to fit into the New World Order or become extinct. And so...
Or become extinct. Does that remind you of Revelation 13 about us being killed? Absolutely. Verse 15,
yeah.
I believe it is, that they shall be killed, that if we do not go along with what they want, we will become extinct.
Right. Right.
Exactly.
And he says individuals may hold out for a longer time, but it will come to the point where they'll have to fit in, or else become
exterminated.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so we dealt in the second issue of Freedom's Ring with the John Paul's confident assessment of the minimalists and Seventh-day Adventists in particular, that they will be absorbed into the full faith of the Roman Catholic Church ultimately.
The thing that was so fascinating for me in your bound volume of Freedom's Ring, and listen, right here at the outset, let's give your address of how the people can get copies of Freedom Ring. If anybody does not have copies of Freedom's Ring, Bob, do you call it a magazine, a newsletter?
It's a paper on religious
paper.
liberty.
Okay. If you're not getting Bob's paper entitled Freedom's Ring, you need to be on his mailing list. Give us the address right now. We'll put it up on the screen.
Right
Bob.
now the paper runs about 18 pages, and the address is Box 200, Hermosa, H-E-R-M-O-S-A, Hermosa, South Dakota, 57744.
Now, do you have a subscription price? How does this work?
Well, we figured that we need to get about $3 per issue to function.
Well, sure.
And that's what we ask for as a
Bless your
contribution,
heart.
as a gift. And the bound volume of all of Volume 1 and Volume 2, we need a gift of $25.
Okay, so for $25, can they get this complete bound edition that you
yeah,
gave to me?
yeah.
What a deal! From the very beginning, you have made it clear that celebration fits right in to the Catholic scheme of bringing all the, quote, Protestant churches that have run away from the Mother Church back into the fold. Explain how celebration fits into all of
That's the next
Bob.
stage, John. I was walking through my personal library one evening, and I was thinking how interesting it would be to lay hands on top Jesuit documents of their plan for accomplishing what Ellen White says in Great Controversy about bringing all the churches back into their fold. And I thought, lacking that, I can deal at least with public material, and I had a copy of the Vatican II documents. The Vatican II documents...
Now that's 2 volumes, isn't it? Because I have 2 volumes of concerning with Vatican II. Now, it was Pope John the 23rd
called it.
Right,
Yes.
back in 1962, wasn't it?
He actually called it on January 25th, 1959.
Okay, now what was Vatican II?
Okay, John, if I could give a little historical background of celebration, I'd like to. Would that be all right?
Absolutely.
First of all, just my encountering the documents of Vatican II, the first section of the documents of Vatican II is the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. And
explain that word.
Liturgy
there are some people that don't
means
know
the
what
worship service
the
format.
worship service. Liturgy, it means the worship service.
Format.
The
and that's,
worship
of course,
format.
what has been agitating our
That's
church.
what celebration is.
Right. Now, the Sacred Council, it says here, has set out to impart ever-increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful, to adapt more closely to the needs of our age those institutions which are subject to change, to foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ, to strengthen whatever can help to call all mankind into the church's fold. Accordingly, it sees particularly cogent reasons for undertaking the reform and promotion of the liturgy.
So this is the foreword or the preface of Vatican II, that it is out to change the worship hour of Protestant churches and to blend them in to the liturgy or the worship service of the Roman Catholic Church.
Because the purpose is to call all mankind into the church's fold, and in Roman Catholic thinking, there's one church.
That's right. And they're going to use the worship structure, the worship hour structure, to do it.
Sure.
That is exactly
the broadest. It reaches the congregation at the broadest level. Everyone's expected to be there.
At the worship hour.
And page 46 calls on the pastors to introduce it gradually, explaining the reasons for it as they go along.
We've heard that.
Now, John, when we look at the term celebration, and incidentally, it occurs on virtually every page of the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy, as many as 14 times on a page. Celebrant, celebration, celebrate.
It's all through Vatican II.
Celebration is the Catholic term for its services. Marriages, funerals, the Eucharist, Mass, they're all celebrations. In fact, even the Council of Trent was called a celebration. And in here we have the bull for the celebration of the Council of Trent.
And yet, I felt that I didn't know where it came from, but suddenly, several years ago, we just began seeing celebration in everything. All of our periodicals, everybody was talking about it in the church bulletins. Suddenly, the word celebration just sprang to life in the Seventh Adventist Church. And I couldn't figure out for the life of me where we got that term. We started naming magazines after it, and everything, everybody all the leadership was talking about celebration this and celebration that. Everything was a celebration. And now to realize that back in 1962, this was the term that was used throughout the documentation of Vatican II for the worship hour. And that's where it comes from.
But it's been called, you see, in Roman Catholicism, celebration is a very ancient term. It's always called its services celebrations. Right, like the Council of Trent was in the 16th century.
And we've just adopted this Catholic term.
All the sessions of the Council of Trent were called celebrations. In fact, it goes back to the mystery religions in Babylon, ancient Babylon. They celebrated the mysteries.
But, Bob, if it was just the word, that would be one thing. But we've adopted much more than just the Catholic word celebration. It's everything that the word celebration in Catholicism entails.
Yes. And the sequence, the historical sequence of developments leading us to the point we are at now is absolutely fascinating and stunning. Now, John, a little more history about this celebration.
Okay.
According to Vatican II, Sunday is the chief celebration of Rome. The chief celebration.
Yes.
And in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, there is a flow that I began noticing. I began underlining things that were paralleling developments in our church, and I saw that musical celebrations were to be the most effective celebrations.
Music has something to do with this?
And the popular music was to be brought in. Now, 25 years ago, that was pretty revolutionary.
Yes.
And we know, we have good friends who were Roman Catholics who are now historic biblical Adventists, and they said they noticed immediately after Vatican II, the guitars were brought in, the whole music was changed. But I want to address some of that a little more in depth a little bit later, John, because here's something that tells us, gives us an ominous note as to where celebration ultimately goes. And that is, in the Spanish Inquisition, the most pious and the most holy celebration of the papacy was the auto de fe, the burning of heretics at the stake. And here I have Henry Charles Lee's History of the Inquisition of Spain. Now, Henry Charles Lee is the definitive work on this subject. He went into the very archives of Spain. It was called a celebrado in the Spanish Inquisition, the service of burning people at the stake. They would have people, they would have choirs singing, Te Deums, they would have 1,000 notables marching, the king would be present, and here's a chapter called The Celebration, right here. The celebration of the auto de fe. And if people found that they were losing their nerve as they watched people burning at the stake and wanted reconciliation with the church, they could request that, and the inquisitors would speak with them. And if they decided to grant them reconciliation, canon law said that they had to spend the rest of their days in prison. So you were faced in the Inquisition, if you were even suspect of a heretic, being a heretic. And Leonard Levy, in his Origins of the Fifth Amendment, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book in 1969, says that anyone that got in the toils of the Inquisition, of all of those individuals, there is not one record of anyone ever escaping unscathed. So once you were suspected, that was it. And it was the stake, if you were faithful, imprisonment if you recanted.
So you had to be so totally against the heretics to escape being even caught. It's kind of like, reminds me of the French Revolution, to where anybody that was even suspect of being a sympathizer was taken to the guillotine.
That's right, John. And Henry Charles Lee also has definitive work on the Inquisition of the Middle Ages. And he tells in this book, this is just a paperback section of it. The 3-volume set is about, yay wide. But he tells of how the inquisitors would come into an area, they would call all the population out, and everyone was to tell everything they knew about any heretics. There was only one area that escaped from this, and that was because the people covenanted not to tell on each other. And the inquisitors couldn't do anything. It was still in the early stages of the Inquisition. They had ways of dealing with that later on. But betrayal of others was the proof of conversion, you see. And what happened was the Inquisition was designed to instill terror in the population, utter fear, so that the people would subject themselves, tell everything they knew. They had records of everything across the Europe, and any heretic, their genealogy was examined, and they kept records for generations.
But Bob, that was hundreds of years ago. That doesn't have anything to do with the Adventist Church and what we're going through today, does it?
Well, what does Great Controversy tell us in the chapter, Liberty of Conscience Threatened?
I'm being facetious, obviously.
I know, John.
That's exactly
but
what
it's coming back.
It's coming back.
It's coming back, and the Pope is absolutely clear that this is where he's wanting to take us to. You see, the Inquisition was the effort to impose uniformity and unity in the church. And in the name of unity, they burned people, imprisoned them, cut their tongues out, tortured them, whatever.
So this what we see of persecution of historic Adventists today in the Seventh-day Adventist Church is minuscule in comparison to what we are going to see in the coming months and years. This is just the beginning. This didn't start out, the Inquisition didn't start out doing this horrendous crimes against mankind. It started out subtly, just as the persecution is starting out now in the Seventh-day Adventist Church subtly. But I want to tell our historic Adventist people that we haven't seen anything. This is child's play in comparison to what God's people are going to have to go through from their very own fellow Seventh-day Adventists before this thing is all said and done. Bob, how have we played into Rome's hands? How have we done their bidding? How has our leadership come to the place where we are following the history of the Inquisition?
Okay, John, I'd like to look at a sequence of developments here with you on this very subject historically. Just look at the facts, and that's what my concern is, to look at the facts. In the 1950s, we as Biblical Adventists know that there is tremendous ferment in our church over the evangelical conferences.
1956, 1957, Questions on Doctrine.
Mm-hmm. And then in 1958, it's very interesting that G.C. Berkouwer, a prominent Dutch Reformed theologian, put out a book, Recent Developments in Roman Catholic Thought, where he examined what was going on in the thinking of Roman Catholicism, and he warned the world that if they could not take a position of we know based on the Word, they would lapse back into the ex cathedra decisions of Rome. The very next year, 1959, Pope John the 23rd, January 25, announces his intention to call an ecumenical council. 1962 to 65, you have the Vatican Council meeting, which would forever change the face of the religious world. And this, of course, calls for revitalized celebration services to attract the world back into the fold of Rome. Now, immediately after that council, in 1966, the Catholic charismatic movement begins exploding. And this all can be documented, John. We have this book, The Pentecostal Movement by Edward D. O'Connor, the definitive study of a dynamic spiritual rebirth from the standpoint of Catholic theology and its significance in Catholic life
So
and
it's
thought
Catholics
today.
looking at Pentecostalism. I'd like to see that.
Well, John, there's a lot more. There's a lot of material that can be produced on this subject.
Catholics looking into Pentecostalism and us understanding today how Pentecostalism fits in with the Catholic strategy to unify all the churches and how they plan on using this speaking in tongues and the charismatic movement and how it ties in with love and unity. Have we been hearing about love and unity in the Seventh Adventist Church?
We've been hammered with it for decades.
Oh,
now.
It's nauseating, Bob. It's that lovesick sentimentalism that Ellen White talks about. And we have just been inundated from every direction with this banner of love and unity, and it comes right out of Vatican II. I mean, reading this material of yours is just phenomenal. This is what's going on in the Seventh Adventist Church. And to realize that it came out of Vatican II in 1962, and that's what we see, you know, here 30 years later in the Seventh Adventist Church.
Exactly. If we are not walking closely with the Lord in the fear of the Lord, we get swept into all of this. At the end of time, there's only two camps, those who are standing on the three angels' messages and Babylon. And Sarah Diamond, who is a sociologist, in her book Spiritual Warfare, The Politics of the Christian Right, documents for us how high-level contacts were made then between the Catholic charismatic movement, which shortly was 1 million members strong, and how they joined in the council organization at the highest levels with the Protestant charismatic movement. They didn't want the members to know about it.
Oh, everything
but they did
secret.
it secretly.
Yes.
And she talks about that in here. This is a very fascinating book because she paints the very picture for us there.
Now we're showing these on screen, and now they can pick these up at the public bookstore or public library. Where can people
in
get
most
these
cases
books?
You can order them like from B. Dalton Bookseller. Now
see.
Documents of Vatican II you can get from Erdman's for $9.95. They pay the shipping on it. You may have to special order them.
So
you know.
any diligent researcher, though, can get their hands on these books that you're referring to.
Oh, absolutely.
I noticed here that it talks about how that they realize that they must educate the ministry into celebration.
Oh, yes.
And that's exactly what we see going on today in the Seventh Adventist Church.
Every institution of higher learning was to promote ecumenism. Now, John, coming in a timeline here, in 1968, it's very interesting what happened because we joined a significant part of the World Council of Churches called the World Confessional Families. And this book documents it, Dictionary of the Ecumenical Movement, which just came out. It costs about $70, this book. But at any rate, we joined it in 1968, the World Confessional Families. The World Confessional Families, which is now...
Does that have anything to do with the World Council of Churches?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very significant, because it is so significant that the top Jesuits, when they go to write a book based on statements or decisions made by the World Council of Churches, they consult heavily with the World Council of Churches. And I'll tell you why. 1968, we joined this. Now it's called Christian World Communions. And at the same time, in the same year, the Vatican Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity joined.
But our people are told whenever they ask B.B. Beach or any of these men at the General Conference if we have anything to do with the World Council of Churches, they categorically deny that we have joined the World Council of Churches or the National Council of Churches and that we have nothing to do with that. We're just an advisory type situation, but we're not members, and they just try to tell our people that this is just these independent ministries stirring up a tempest in a teapot, and it's not true. But now you're saying that we're a member of what?
On a technicality, John, we are not a technical member, but we belong to the World Confessional Families, which the Roman Catholic Church belongs to. And the Roman Catholic Church is swinging a tremendous influence in the World Council of Churches, having joint working groups, etc. And not only that, but we have been sitting on the Faith and Order Commission. Now, this is a book on Faith and Order, 1985, 1989, which is the most important commission in the World Council of Churches. This is a report on their meeting in 1989. And right in the back here, you can read who our representative is on it. Dr. Raul Dedern, Seventh-day Adventist Church, SDA Theological Seminary. And he's been sitting on this. We have had a representative on faith and order.
One of our major professors teaching our theologians, training our pastors, and then we wonder why we hear what we hear from the Adventist pulpits today.
One reason, John, our ministry worldwide could not cope with the Fordite issue was because they were already several steps down the new theology from their training. For decades now, new theology positions on the nature of sin and the nature of Christ have been taught at the seminary, and that's why the rank-and-file minister couldn't come to grips with it, because he was already several steps down that road.
You say here that the pattern was set, celebrate, then annihilate. Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, that's just what we were talking about, because the union of the churches, according to great controversy, is the last step before persecution. And persecution at the end of time ultimately winds up in the universal death decree against the faithful.
Bob, can we give encouragement to our historic Adventists that the fact that the celebration movement from Catholicism has now come in full force into the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that the next step is major persecution and the time of trouble, that this is just the precursor of what we're going into as far as the time of trouble, the beginning of the time of trouble?
John, this is not my position only. Talking to other prominent, faithful, eminent leaders of our church who are biblical Adventists, they concur with this, John, that we are now in the early stages of something that is going to develop and deepen and become worldwide, global. And as we see the New World Order developing, and all of these things, maybe a little later on we can look at some of the constitutional and international developments, but all of these things point to the striking fulfillment of what we have been preaching, John, for years and years.
What an exciting time to live. What does celebration have to do with the three angels' message?
Well, celebration for the Roman Catholic movement and for the World Council of Churches is their code term for liturgical change and liturgical matters, just like Rome's code term for labor unions is what? Solidarity.
Oh, yes.
You see? That's here in America as well as over in Poland.
Sure.
So this is their term for the convergence of the churches. Now, John, by the time we get to 1974, there's secret high-level union taking place now between the Catholic and Protestant charismatic movements. 1977, of course, the World Confessional Families are meeting in Rome, and our representative at those meetings, B.B. Beach, gives the gold medal to the Pope on May 18 of 1977. In 1981, Father Braun, Roman Catholic, gives the keynote address at the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship World Convention. The Vatican Charismatic Movement monthly publication in the 1980s, New Covenant, mirrors the Protestant Pentecostal paper Charisma. So you have now convergence taking place. Now, convergence is a big thing in all of this. This is a World Council of Churches book entitled Baptism and Eucharist, Ecumenical Convergence in Celebration, and that answers your question. Celebration is the term that is being used here for the ecumenical convergence that's taking place. Now, this is dealing with two key areas that Rome is interested in unifying the churches, baptism
in celebration.
And Eucharist.
That's so obvious, because you see, celebration totally negates the three angels' message.
Yes, it does. It is the opposite. See, there are two movements at the end of time, and these movements cross all boundaries. There is God's movement of the three angels' messages to every nation, kindred,
calling
tribe,
people out,
to pull people out of Babylon, every aspect of Babylonian
and celebration gets everybody in unity.
And the other movement is the ecumenical movement, which is bringing all the people, knitting them together in Babylon with the coalition of the papacy, spiritualism, and apostate Protestantism.
Unbelievable.
So these two things, and you see, we're going to see company after company leave and tribe after tribe come in. There's going to be great confusion and people crossing the boundaries. But the defining point is the three angels' messages,
Amen.
because that's the cleaver of truth. That's the mighty cleaver.
Man, isn't that exciting?
Now, John, it's interesting in this book here. This book came out in the 1980s, and it describes that there is a two-pronged movement in celebration. One is to change the liturgies, and as the churches come together theologically and ecumenically, the liturgy expresses the convergence that is taking place substantively in the thinking of the churches, and they converge together liturgically. So the first prong is liturgical convergence. The second prong
and that's adopting the same type of worship style.
Yes. The second prong is to bring all the churches under the control of the church, all the individuals under the control of the church, and the church will regulate all of human life according to the times. Does that does that sound like Daniel 7:25?
Yes. What do you mean? It sounds like the Seventh-day Adventist Church today, trying to control every portion of our lives.
Well, but I'm talking about a global picture here of what Rome is wanting to do. Now, it's interesting that in the documents of Vatican II, part of the strategy is to bring all the churches together on the matter of the Eucharist, to bring the Protestant churches closer and closer, and in their Lord's...
Explain to some exactly what the Eucharist is.
All right, the Eucharist is the dedicated host. When the priest says...
The little wafer.
The wafer, the hoc est corpus meum, this is my body.
Yeah.
Then it is something to be worshipped.
They say it's actually the body of Christ.
Now, John, there were thousands of people that lost their lives for speaking out against this idolatry.
That one thing.
They would be put to death just for a word against it. If they didn't kneel as it went by in a procession. Incidentally, processions are being called for. There is so much that is involved in all of this. And in 1982, a prominent SDA theologian representing our church signs a certain critical document, John, and that is the Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry document in Lima, Peru, 1982. We signed that. Right on the back here, John, it says, over 100 theologians met in Lima, Peru in January 1982 and recommended unanimously to transmit this agreed statement, the Lima text, for the common study and official response of the churches. They represented virtually all the major church traditions: Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Old Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, Reformed, Methodist, United Disciples, Baptist, Adventist, and Pentecostal.
Seventh-day.
So it's right there on the back of this document. Now, this document calls for the churches to unify in the areas of baptism, Eucharist, which the World Council, the Ecumenical Council of Vatican II called for. Incidentally, ask for Volume 1 when you get it from Erdman's. Baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. So the integration of the ministry is involved, John, and we've been seeing that for years.
Absolutely.
In some areas, our Adventist ministers now are the leading ecumenical ministers. They have been holding the worldwide week of prayer for Christian unity, which is viewed by the World Council of Churches as one of the most fundamental things that has to be done for ecumenical unity. And we are now hearing reports from the East Coast, the West Coast, New Zealand, Australia, of ministers calling the Lord's Supper the Eucharist. They are calling the people forward to receive the bread in the front, Roman Catholic style.
When I started Prophecy Countdown in 1984, in 1985, the Florida Conference sent a pastor in to the Bonita Springs church that I had pastored, and I'd stepped down and started doing television ministry through Prophecy Countdown full time. The pastor that they sent in to take my place, I remember how startled I was in our first communion when the pastor, the Seventh-day Adventist minister that the conference had sent in to take my place, and by the way, to get me out of that church, started using the term the Eucharist in referring to communion. I couldn't believe it. He started using Catholic terms. This is the first hint that I had ever had of how our Seventh-day Adventist ministers were being trained to use Catholic terms. It was unbelievable. Here in your paper, Freedom's Ring, you not only have that celebration is the Vatican code word for the new style church services, but you go on and show how that the reading of the Psalms, now there's nothing wrong with reading of the Psalms. I read the Psalms all the time. But how it plays into the celebration movement, you also bring in about the physical movements of celebration, such as applause.
They were necessary, viewed as necessary physical movement in
and you have brought in all this stuff and gone to Catholic sources and found how that all of this stuff was part of the things that were mandated there out of Vatican II for celebration. This is exactly what we have in the celebration movement.
The Garden of Prayer is right here.
The Garden of Prayer, the applause, the reading of the Psalms, the words upon the screen. I mean, and then the music. You go into the music, how this has all been planned. This reminds me, Bob, this reminds me of how we as Seventh Adventists for years have done research on Sunday worship. Yeah. And how we go back and show people, look, you know, this thing just didn't all of a sudden happen on the church. It's been brought in over hundreds of years, very slowly and subtly, how that Satan has brought the Sunday worship in through the Catholic Church into the Christian church. And that's where we are today. But I find exactly the same thing with celebration. It has come to the Christian church and into the Seventh Adventist church much faster, but in the same way that Satan brought Sunday worship into the Christian church. It's unbelievable. You've gone to Catholic sources and researched and found all this stuff. I mean, this is mind-boggling to our Adventist people, Bob.
John, you know, as you look at what's happened in the 80s now, there is an acceleration that's happened chronologically. By the mid-1980s, there is a steady stream of literature pouring into the hands of charismatics around the world calling for unity, and the Jesuit Cardinal Augustine B. reports favorably on Pentecostalism's fresh infusion of energy into the Vatican effort to achieve unity. John, here we have Confessions in Dialogue. This is a survey of bilateral conversations among world confessional families. We belong to this organization and in the World Council of Churches, as well as Roman Catholicism. Now, in this book, it's very significant and very interesting that in 1972, meetings were held between the Pentecostal Church and the Roman Catholic Church. The dialogue was between the Vatican Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity and actually had its beginnings in 1969 and 1970. Now, the Vatican joined the World Confessional Families in 68, the same year that we did. 69, they're talking with the Pentecostals.
Are you saying or hinting that there is some type of union that has taken place between the Catholic Church and the Pentecostal Church to use the Pentecostal tongue-speaking charismatic movement, tying it in with Catholicism to bring a one-world church and a unity among all churches?
Let me tell you exactly what they say. The concluding sentence of the account of the 1973 meeting illustrates the amazing change in mutual attitudes that has occurred within the last few decades. Quote, the participants in the dialogue, now this is between Rome and the Pentecostals, right, have become increasingly aware of the growing extent and dimension of the Pentecostal churches and the charismatic renewal, and realize that these movements could have profound repercussions on the renewal of the churches and progress towards Christian unity.
You know, it only makes sense that Catholicism and Pentecostalism join hands because they are being both led, have been led from the outset by the same person.
Same spirit.
Same spirit is leading both.
Yes. Spiritualism is very deep in the Roman Catholic Church.
Spiritualism and Catholicism,
That's
and those
right.
two unions coming together. Isn't that exactly what our prophet said would happen?
Exactly. And so here we have from their own lips in the early 70s, late 60s, their plans of working together for the unification of the churches. So the Pentecostal charismatic renewal is the vehicle which Rome is using to bring all the churches back into her fold. That's why we have the Pentecostal dimensions to the celebration movement in our church.
And how are they tying the Eucharist into all this with Pentecostalism?
That's right. The Eucharist is seen as the basis for Christian unity. Okay, so that has to do with the Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry document. Now, remember that the documents of Vatican II called for unity in the area of the Eucharist. Now the World Council of Churches takes this up, and they put out this document, the most significant document in the 55-year history of the Faith and Order Commission, and we ourselves, in our response to it, call it the most significant document, calling for unity in the area of the Eucharist. Now, right away, the Jesuits got on this, and Karl Rahner, who is probably the top Jesuit of this century, joined up with Heinrich Fries, a Roman Catholic ecumenical theologian, and put out this book in 1983, 1 year after this comes out. 1 year after that, they come out with their strategy for the unification of the churches.
Explain what the role of the Jesuits is in the Seventh Adventist Church, Bob, to those who may not know.
The role of the Jesuits is to undo all that Protestantism has done. Ignatius Loyola came on the scene about the time.
What is that? Explain exactly what what is it?
Ignatius Loyola.
Ignatius Loyola.
Right. That's right. He is the head of the Jesuits, the founder of the Jesuits. The very century that Luther was promoting the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation was spearheaded by the Jesuit order. Now, that will tie in, and I think we want to look at that just a little bit later, John. That will tie in with the mysticism that is being brought into our churches now, and the actual introduction of the spiritual exercises of the Jesuits. But I'd like to touch that a little later on in more depth.
So you see, not only are we dealing with celebration, we're dealing with neurolinguistic programming.
Right.
So this is all going to tie in. This is exciting to see the research that you've done, Bob, and what
it all ties in with the New Age too. But right now, let's keep on our track of looking at the chronology, John, of this is so significant. Now, I'd like to just hit a point here out of this book, which is most significant. In fact, I came across this book because I was walking through a bookstore and noticed this book promoting unity, Themes in Lutheran Catholic Dialogue. I just opened the book up, and I saw on page 58 here a discussion of Rayner and Fry's book here, Unity of the Churches. And here's their strategy, just the gross strategy, the overview.
And you just happened to find this as you were walking through a bookstore?
Oh, yes. I case the bookstores carefully.
Just stumble upon this stuff.
In contrast to this, the author writes, George Anderson and James Crumley, Rayner, that's the Jesuit, and Fry's attention focuses on the hierarchical, juridical, and institutional. So they are interested in bringing about the unification of the churches, utilizing the hierarchical patterns in the churches and the institutional dimension of it, and the juridical. Unification is seen as proceeding from top to bottom. So you get the top ones first, and it filters down to the lower echelons of the church, from higher levels to lower ones. Perhaps the most vivid indication of this is when they argue that Protestants on the whole are just as passive in their church membership as Catholics, and therefore can be expected to follow their leaders into union with Rome. Now, after reading that statement, I knew I had to get Rayner's book. So I ordered it. And here is what Rayner says about this very subject. What he is discussing is his concern about how will the leaders of the churches have sufficient authority to bring their members back into union with Rome. He spends several pages on this because he is concerned that there might be the possibility
of a backlash,
that enough vital Protestantism may be residual in these churches that will rise up and oppose the reunion with Rome.
You better believe there is.
But he thinks he's got a solution here, and here's what he says. However, even if one recognizes a significant difference in parish life between Catholic and Protestant congregations with respect to ecclesiastical leadership, the average congregation in the Protestant churches, in fact, usually practices the kind of obedience to their church leaders that is customary in the Roman Catholic Church. I'd like to digress for just a second here, John, and talk about the way the Jesuit strategy functions. They like to infiltrate.
Yes.
They like to change the thinking, the philosophy, the attitudes, the ideology. They like to prepare and take plenty of time making their preparation. And then when the time comes to strike, they strike with lightning speed when they feel that they have gained what they're wanting through the honeycombing of the structure that they're working with.
Yes.
This happened in Eastern Europe. In fact, by the early 1980s, Malachi Martin says that the preponderance of the Eastern Orthodox bishops and Russian Orthodox bishops were prepared to accept the primacy of the Pope. And when they knew their hour of infiltration had reached far enough, then they struck. Bang, 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 and all those nations fall at their feet. But now listen here to the rest of this paragraph. It is so significant. So what would they be interested in doing, John? They want to get the congregation so that they have the same attitude toward the leadership that the Roman Catholic congregation has to theirs.
Hypnotism.
Therefore, one should not overestimate the danger of a rebellion at the grassroots against their ecclesiastical leaders' decisions regarding unification. On the basis of their theological expertise and their religious conscience, the representatives of this ecclesiastical leadership can decide in favor of church unity and can also work with sufficient zeal among the church members to gain their understanding for this decision. So if a grassroots rebellion starts, all that has to happen is for the ecclesiastical leadership to be a little more zealous and use their expertise that the average person doesn't have to knit them into the fold as they go step by step. And I will say this, it is a step-staged process.
Yes, we have seen that.
Step-stage process.
We have absolutely seen that.
Now, a number of other significant things that Rayner brings out in this book, John, is that in the world church to be that the Jesuits envision, each church will keep its own structure. It's far more subtle than most people realize. Each church will keep its own structure and will have its own set of fundamental beliefs, but they will work together in an atmosphere of reconciled diversity. And they will ultimately be led to recognize the Petrine service of the papacy as being the guarantor of love and unity and orthodoxy. The ministries will be integrated by working together on the same kind of programs. And we're seeing that type of thing taking place on the local level in our church.
Bob, this is incredible stuff that you're showing us, and it's pretty heavy, you know, deep stuff. And our people are really going to have to probably watch these videos more than once. They're going to have to watch them over and over again. I get letters all the time from people who say, I've watched your NLP1 tape, 10 times. And if they have had to do that in order to absorb all the material that we have, I can just imagine how they're going to have to get these videos and watch them over and over and over again to really assimilate everything that we're dealing with here. Here is something that we just got in the mail. It's really something. This day of taping, this just came in the mail just this morning. I'll be very honest with you. I have not had much time to spend with it. I just thumbed through it quickly before taping. I'm going to show it to you for the first time. This is from Andrews University. It's their yearbook, their joker that shows the pictures of all their students. And I just want you, we're going to show it on screen to the viewers, and I just want you, with your knowledge and expertise in this field, to start going through this new picture book from Andrews University, our theological seminary here in the United States for our Seventh Adventist ministers and our Seventh Adventist College and University, and just give your definitions of thought in turning the pages after we have been hearing and studying about what we've been talking about so far, how that this has been Catholicism's plan to get all of these churches, especially the Seventh Adventist Church, back into back into the Catholic vice. And I want you to see what you think of this picture book, this joker, this yearbook. I guess it's called The Cast here at Andrews University. Tell us what you think of it.
John, this is one of the most striking things that I've seen. I heard about this before I
have heard about it, too. This is the first time I've seen it,
Today is the first time I've seen it. And the whole artistry of the book is blatantly, not even, what is a better word than blatant? It is incredibly Roman Catholic. First of all, here right on the title page, we have the two fingers of the Pope, the papal sign that Ellen White utterly condemned.
Yes.
And then we have the picture of apparently the Virgin Mary. It's in the same posture as the Virgin Mary is characteristically pictured with a halo. And then you go through a few pages of the pictures, and then you have another figure, medieval figure with a halo of sorts on the head, and you pass through some more pictures, and you have a monk with a shaven crown pondering with a halo around his head.
Now, Bob, what would possess Andrews University to print this abomination?
Well, you know what I think it is, John? I think it's the same thing that possessed Malachi Martin to write his book. They are so confident now that they are being bold.
Blatant.
Bold. The Roman Catholic plan for the takeover of this planet is not secret, stealthy thing anymore. No. It's open. It's right there in the open, just like Mein Kampf with Hitler. The next picture. This is, to me, probably one of the most startling ones in the book.
Most offensive.
And offensive. Look at the scantily clad aspect of Christ, and there is the pouring of water instead of the baptism. This is
totally a Catholic method of paganism that is brought into the Christian church.
Incidentally, that fits right in with the theme of coming together in the area of baptism.
Yes.
With the baptism, Eucharist, and ministry.
Oh, what is that one?
This one, here you have the papal sign again. You comment on that one, John, yourself.
Rejoice with me, I have found my sheep. Look at the two fingers. Now, why I mean, do you think, Bob, do you think that the editors of this yearbook, who are students...
But you have staff working on it.
Oh, yeah, I understand. You have Andrew's staff. They cannot get... They can say, oh, well, the students do this. We didn't have anything to do with it. That is baloney. Do you think there's any way, though, that they could have done this innocently?
Oh, no. I mean, it's a planned thing. That's all the artwork. All the artwork is of this character in this book. And coming along here, we have Catholic rendition of the Lord's Supper. You have the halos, and coming on further, here's a very striking one. At that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book.
Now, what is that saying? That's saying that those Catholic people there, the monks, the priests, are part of God's people during the time of trouble, and these are the 144,000.
The nuns, these are the ones that will be delivered.
This is unbelievable. I mean, did you ever dream that our church, that our institutions, that people calling themselves Seventh-day Adventist would not only be looking at, but be promoting and printing and endorsing this type of thing in the periodicals of our institutions?
And the significance of Andrews is enormous, because there you have the pastors in training, the administrators, the teachers from the entire world field. Here's one of a figure with the nun's neck piece that comes way up to the chin. And on the back is one of the most significant of all. Behold the man, it says, and there's a Catholic picture of Christ with the two-finger sign of the Pope with one hand, and in the other hand there's a crystal ball, which represents the union of spiritualism and the papacy.
Yes. That printing from Andrews University is absolutely so significant that it just shows that everything we've been talking about thus far on this video is being promoted by our Seventh-day Adventist leadership, by our institutions, and even by our theological seminary that is training our ministers. Our people need to wonder no more why they are hearing what they are hearing from our Seventh-day Adventist pulpits. Our people need to wonder no more why they are hearing preached on Sabbath things they have never heard preached before, why they are reading in our periodicals things they have never seen in print from the Seventh-day Adventist Church before. They can understand now why there is such a diabolical persecution being organized against the independent ministries who are daring to stand up against this apostasy that is taking place in our church. I mean, our people, surely, by this time, anybody who is sincere, historic Adventist can see the mindset of our leadership and where this denomination is headed and who is in control of it.
Absolutely. John, it is absolutely stunning and astounding. It's as if in some of the statements I have run across, and we want to look at some of them in a few minutes, it's as if we're following the script precisely that is laid out.
An agenda, like you say, a script. It's like we're following a script. I can't think of a better definition for what it is.
John, in this Karl Rayner's book of the Unity of the Churches, we have some very, very significant things which...
What page are you on there?
Well, it's the next to the last issue, John.
Okay.
In yours, it may be the last issue.
It's like the Jesuits have planned all this, and we're following their pre-planned script.
Well, I think that when we understand what the Jesuits are saying and we compare it, it leads us to some very sober reflections. John, here on page 8, for example, there are a number of theses in this book, Unity of the Churches.
What month is this?
All right, this would be the October month.
Okay, October 91?
Right, 1991.
Okay.
The first thesis deals with the use of creeds. And I'd like to just comment on that for a minute, John, because when we responded to this baptism, Eucharist, and ministry document, you see all the churches are to respond to this. 186 churches.
And the Seventh Adventist Church signed with that, right?
We not only signed calling for the unity of the churches, but we sent in our official response, and that's in this book, Churches Respond to BEM, that's Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, Volume 2, the official response.
And Seventh Adventist Church is listed in that official document? Who is the Seventh Adventist representative that signed this?
The one on the Faith and Order Commission, I understand, Dr. Dettern.
Dr. Dettern. And he is, and isn't it amazing, he teaches at the Theological Seminary at Andrews, right?
Oh, yes.
Of course.
Has for decades.
Absolutely.
John, I first came across the fact that we had responded from this book, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry, 1982 to 1990, Report on the Process and Responses. You see, it's a process of convergence. And all the churches are responding and discussing what they agree with, what they disagree with, how they react to this statement.
But yet, if you ask any of our church officials if any of this stuff is going on, they will lie to our people. They lie to our people and say, no, oh no, we're having nothing to do with this. This is not going on. And here, these publications that you and your research have just gone to the public bookstores and libraries and found, it lists us, and we find out, and our people are waking up to the fact that our denominational leadership has been involved in this for years.
Right. Oh, for decades.
And our people have been lied to by our leadership.
For decades. It's been going on behind the scenes. Now, I first stumbled on the fact that we had made a response from this book on the process and responses of the churches. And here it lists a number of categories of churches that responded, and it says some communions have adopted one common response: Roman Catholic Church, Salvation Army, and Seventh-day Adventists. And the report that was drawn up for the Roman Catholic Church was prepared by the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity in collaboration. Incidentally, the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity sits with us on the World Confessional Families, or Christian World Communions now. It was prepared by them in collaboration with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. That's the modern term for the Holy Office of the Inquisition. So they responded, we responded. So I desperately wanted to get our response, to examine it and see just what we said, because the Unity of the Churches strategy by Karl Rahner rests upon the Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry document, which in turn rests upon the documents of Vatican II. And in the very beginning of the Unity of the Churches book by Karl Rahner, it discusses how the book was produced in collaboration and in consultation with the World Confessional Families, which we are a part of, and the Roman Catholic Church is a part of, and the Faith and Order Commission, which we have a member sitting on, you see.
You know, I'm just overwhelmed as I'm sitting here listening to you present all this information to us. The debt of gratitude, number one, that the historic Adventists owe to you for the research that you have done, but also our thanks be to God for putting this, for inspiring you to do this, for calling you into this, because God realized that our historic Adventist people had to have a valid researcher that collected all this data. And we have been involved in this ecumenical movement and this joining and clasping the hands of the Roman power and bringing Roman Catholicism right into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And it's been going on for years. And how this whole celebration movement has been calculated and planned, and we are following a preset agenda.
I even had, just a few days ago, a couple sent me a tape of a sermon that was preached in their church, along with the transcript of the tape, in which the pastor told the congregation that Catholic means universal. Therefore, you are Catholic Adventists. And he said, more specifically, you are a Roman Catholic. And I listened to it with my own ears on the tape.
Now, this is a Seventh-day Adventist ministry?
Yes, right from the pulpit, Sabbath morning. Here is the statement I'm referring to. This book on the strategy based on the BEM document and the Vatican II is a product of seasoned scholars building on the earlier work of the Second Vatican Council, the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches, dialogues and theological reflection in world confessional families like the Lutheran World Federation. So it's all tied together. You see, it's all interlocking. And in the first thesis, the creedal element becomes very dominant. And John, this is what is very clear.
Now, what do you mean by creedal? You mean what's taken from the creed of the Roman Catholic Church?
Let me just read the thesis. It says, the fundamental truths of Christianity, as they are expressed in Holy Scripture, in the Apostles' Creed and that of Nicaea and Constantinople, are binding on all partner churches of the one church to be. You see, what the Jesuits want to do is bypass the 16th century Reformation, go back to the way things were before that, and it is very open that Rainer, very clear, that Rainer regards, and the Jesuits regard, the Protestant Reformation as a rebellion which took place, but now the churches are laying aside their rebellion, they have ecumenical consciousness, they're all coming back to the mother church.
Come back home.
Come back home.
Telling all the Protestant churches to come back home.
Let's have love and unity.
Let's have love and unity and celebration together.
Absolutely. That's it.
That's the code word.
So now, remember how the church went into apostasy. The arguments from the great controversy were that Ellen White records that were current when the apostasy was developing, was that with some concessions on their part, that's the idolaters, they proposed that Christians should make concessions that all might unite on the platform of belief in Christ. Yes.
Constantine.
Now, a very important part of this first thesis is, as they comment on it, Heinrich Fries comments on it in the book, the one church to be is a possibility only if it is a community of faith. Now, I ran into that over and over again at the seminary. In the scholarly writings of the Jesuits and the scholars, there is this emphasis on the community of faith. Only the community of faith can do theology. Only the community of faith is prior to the individual. The individual is assumed into the community of faith. What they do is they take the Protestant Reformation of the priesthood of all believers and turn it on its head. And the church takes emphasis over the individual. Now, I have a book over here, John, that I'd like to refer to. It's a book by a Jesuit from Notre Dame. Yes, here it is.
What did he have to say?
This is Mackenzie from Notre Dame, and he goes in some detail at the beginning of this book to describe the fact that the church community has priority over the individual. And the church gives the word to the individual. Therefore, you see, if that is the case, then the church is above the word.
Yes.
The word comes out of the church. Therefore, the church has priority over the word.
And if you don't accept the word of the church, then you are divisive.
And you're in apostasy.
You're in apostasy, and you're a heretic.
That's exactly
it seems like I've heard that someplace before.
Yes, and you see, what is the Protestant concept? The Protestant concept is that the word has preeminence.
Amen.
And the church is to be in submission to the word.
Yes.
And the message of the word calls the church into being. That's how our movement got started.
That's why we are Protestants.
That's right.
Because we won't accept the interpretation of the church of the Word. We are the priesthood of all believers who are able to stand on our own two spiritual feet. That's what Martin Luther said. That's what started this whole thing.
John, I want to touch on something here before we move too far. And I have another book here I want you to see.
You've got a lot of books, Bob. And, you know, we're just going to keep the tape rolling, brother. You just show us this material that you've got.
This is a book by one of the most prominent Jesuits, John Courtney Murray, Society of Jesus. We hold these truths, Catholic Reflections on the American Proposition. Now, what this Jesuit does, and he is very intelligent and very keen.
Do you know a Jesuit that is not? I mean, these guys are masters at what they do.
What this book is, John, he attacks the foundations of the philosophy upon which our Constitution rests. And he attacks John Locke. Now, John Locke propounded the concept of the law of nature, upon which our concept of inalienable human rights, natural rights, rests. He attacks that, and he says that is selfish. And what we need is Roman Catholic natural law, in which he makes a sharp distinction between the law of nature of John Locke and Roman Catholic natural law. Now, Roman Catholic natural law.
That's what Clarence Thomas.
Exactly.
All through the hearings for Clarence Thomas, that's what I kept hearing over and over and over again, was this natural law. What was he talking about? What's this natural law that Clarence Thomas was talking about?
The one who developed it to its apex was Thomas Aquinas, the greatest systematic theologian that the Catholic Church has ever had, and it rests on Plato's Republic. And what it means, basically, John, is that this man is attacking the Protestant foundations. You see, in the Protestant thinking, the priority of conscience in direct submission to the Word and to Jesus Christ assumes precedent. And the concept of the priesthood of all believers was so powerful, and the experience of the Reformers was so strong, and in the Puritan movement, that government had to shape itself around that. Churches had to shape itself around it. Like Ellen White says, that the Pilgrim Fathers that came here founded a nation without a king and a church without a pope, because individual conscience was supreme. Now, if vital Protestantism is gone, and that supremacy of individual conscience in relationship to God is gone, natural law can move in, because in natural law, the individual submits to the order imposed by the church and the state.
So this natural law that our new Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas believes in is Catholic-oriented.
Absolutely.
It is a Catholic law. And when he was talking about natural law, he was talking about a Roman Catholic principle.
Well, they are studying this book at Catholic universities. This is Catholic thinking. This is the Catholic blueprint for undermining and destroying our Constitution. But why I point this out, John, is because this Jesuit attack upon the primacy of individual conscience is so broad and far-reaching, it's hitting every aspect of our society as well as our church. And what we're struggling with in our church right now is which concept is going to be supreme? Is the Word going to be supreme, and the individual conscience in submission to that Word, which is Protestantism, according to Ellen White's chapter on the protest at Spires? Conscience is above the church? Or will it be a situation where the church dominates the conscience, and the conscience has to submit to church structure and government structure?
That's the struggle that's going on in the Seventh Adventist Church between the organized conferences and the independent ministries. And the independent ministries are pleading with our people to please read and study on their own. It's the Protestant concept of doing your own reading and researching and standing on your own spiritual feet. And the conference is saying, just trust us, stay with the conference. The church is going through, and the church is the conference. The conference is the church, and just trust us. And if you need to know anything, it'll come out in the Union paper or in the Adventist Review. Just trust. I see now.
It is the struggle between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism taking place right now in our church.
In the Seventh Adventist Church, and that's the struggle between the independent ministries and the conference. Is the principle of Protestantism versus Catholicism.
Exactly.
You realize that in as long as we've been in this struggle that I have never realized that it was Protestantism versus Catholicism. I mean, it may seem elementary and simple to you, but I will have to be totally honest with you that this is the first time that I have really understood this for what it was, that we're dealing with Protestantism and Catholicism.
Exactly.
Between the independent ministries and the organized conferences. One is people standing on their own two spiritual feet, and the other is trust the church.
And it is a fierce battle, believe me.
Unbelievable.
It is a fierce battle.
Unbelievable.
And that's why this book, Great Controversy, every lesson in it we have to have mastered.
Oh.
Every lesson.
I tell you, I just feast on that book. If there's one thing that people have learned from my videos, it's my love for the triumph of God's love, the Great Controversy, and I just love that big colporteur edition there with the big print, and I just go through, when I get to the end, I go through it again. If our people were just reading and studying, they could see this thing for what it is.
That's right.
It's a struggle between Protestantism and Catholicism.
Absolutely. And this struggle over the Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry document is precisely that. Because let me read to you a little bit out of the Waldensian response. You know the old Waldenses?
Oh, yes.
They responded to this. Now, I don't believe they should be in this process any more than we should. But they were notable for their rejection of the basic premise of the BEM document, whereas we were noted in the materials that came out from the Faith and Order Commission. In this book, we were noted as being one of the most affirmative churches in affirming our appreciation
to the Roman Catholic Church,
to the Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry document. We, as well as the Roman Catholic Church, were noted in here for our appreciation.
Well, that's why we have the Roman Catholics coming to our general conference sessions in Indianapolis and addressing the group and welcoming them, and why we are just mollycoddling the Roman Catholics, because we are one of the Protestant churches that is being the quickest to clasp the hands of the Roman power. It's absolutely unbelievable. And still, our faithful Adventist people that have been in the church all their lives are saying, just stay with the church. The church is going through. Did you read that article in the recent review with the ship on the front? Was it by Roger Kuhn? Who was it by? Or the article on, or maybe it was Robert Olson, about how that the church is going through and twisting the writings of Ellen White, showing that the conference is the church. We've got to stay with the conference, and our people are just accepting this stuff. Do you know why, Bob?
They're not studying.
Took the words right out of my mouth. They're not studying. Our people are not studying.
No one of us, I believe, understands the gravity of this issue. Because Satan's plan, according to Great Controversy, is to get people away from studying for themselves and to put their confidence in pastors, teachers, professors of theology, and church leaders.
Blind leading the blind.
She's warned us. It's there. But the Waldenses, what did they say? They had the strongest criticism of all the churches. Among this group of critical comments, the strongest ones come from the Waldensian and Methodist churches in Italy. Their synod points out, together with differentiations and affirmative remarks, that BEM, quote, indicates a convergence in a sacramental and clerical direction, that's what we're talking about, which is opposite to the direction in which the gospel calls the church in its witness in the world, and that, quote, this ecumenical document centers the faith, communion, and Christian witness not on God and the gospel, but rather on the church as a sacred structure that has and gives guarantees of the Spirit's activities through a caste endowed with priestly powers, mediatorial, and representing the divine. And that is exactly the struggle that we're in now.
Bob, you keep referring to these BEM volume. Okay, this is volume 6.
That has the Roman Catholic response in it. Now this has the Seventh-day Adventist response in it.
Okay, now all these why? I just realized they all have these 3 wavy lines all the way. What are these? Do you think there's any significance to these 3 wavy lines on all these? Now these are the responses.
The responses of the churches to the document.
Of the churches to Vatican II?
Well, in essence, that's what it boils down to, because the Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry document rests on that. This is printed by the World Council of Churches.
This is printed by the World Council of Churches.
Right.
Do you think there's any significance to these three wavy lines on all of these BEM documents?
What do you see in it, John?
I see something that very closely looks like our new ingathering brochure.
Is that right?
There are three wavy lines almost in all the artwork on every page of the new ingathering brochure to be used for this year's ingathering campaign. There are three wavy lines. And then it comes down to the end to where it just goes into one wavy line. Now, what do you see anything in these three wavy lines of apostate Protestantism, Catholicism, and spiritualism?
Well, there's three parts to Babylon, I know that.
And then at the end it goes into one line to where it takes the three elements of the three unclean the three unclean spirits like frogs that go together into one at the very end of the brochure. It's startling. And I see these same three wavy lines on all of this stuff that's from the World Council of Churches. You know, I see
right there,
I see it on this.
It's in all of them. It's even on the BEM document.
Is this the first time that you've noticed this?
I didn't. It didn't register with me about the three lines on every one of them.
Have you seen our ingathering brochure?
No, I haven't.
Oh, you haven't. So I'm telling you about this for the first time.
That's right. We're both learning today.
I'm noticing that on all of these books we've got these three wavy lines on all of them. And this is exactly the three wavy lines that are in the new Seventh-day Adventist ingathering brochure. And it represents apostate Protestantism, Catholicism, and spiritualism, and they're all coming together. You know, this is just incredible stuff, Bob.
John, you know, what led us into all of this was the fact that as I breezed quickly through the Seventh-day Adventist response here, I underlined and made notes where we referred to the fundamental beliefs, because the first part, the very first thesis of the strategy for bringing all the churches together, the Jesuit strategy, is this matter of a creed in the community of faith. Incidentally, there was a recent editorial in the Review that strongly supported this concept of the community of faith and opposed the idea that anyone could develop theology in isolation, like Noah or Elijah or Moses, you know, or anything like this. Anyway, over and over again, the fundamental beliefs are referred to. There is not one direct quote from the Bible or the Spirit of Prophecy in our response.
All we refer to is our creed.
Fundamental beliefs.
Have we adopted a creed, Bob?
Well, de facto, yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
And it's in the Review editorials. You know,
we have established a creed, and that has become our document of faith.
But what is so significant about it, John, is that the Jesuits like to have a church moved on to a creed, because then they can work that creed. And the creed can change and evolve into bringing all the churches back together.
Does our church manual change? You better believe it does. To the whims of the conference brethren, they change it.
I will say that they did a rather strict analysis in comparison to our fundamental beliefs, and they did even make the comment here that the BEM document is too Catholic in intent, but I would emphasize that there is always a staged development in the process. And you see, this crucial fact for me is that it's resting on a creed now. Our response to this. First of all, we shouldn't be in the process of ecumenism at all. Second of all, the fact that we are now resting our case on a creed, which is changing steadily.
I just thought of something, Bob. I'm not trying to change the subject. I just thought of something, and I want to comment on it. Do you realize what you are opening yourself up to, coming here to Prophecy Countdown and appearing in this video with me? They have absolutely unleashed the demons of hell upon me in this ministry. Every type of diabolical smear tactic that they possibly can use against me, they have used, and are continuing, and it is intensifying daily. They have disfellowshipped me personally. They have disbanded my church. They have done every form of persecution that is legal thus far. They have hired a full-time pastor, taken him from his church to do nothing but in private investigation try to dig up dirt on me, and have made the rounds of all former employees of Prophecy Countdown, disgruntled church members of the Rolling Hills Church, anybody that has anything that is of a disparaging nature that they can come up with against Prophecy Countdown. They are even trying to come up with to make a video to refute what I am doing. Do you understand, and have you understood before this moment, what you were doing when you appear on this video with me, and the truth that you are bringing out? Do you realize how this is going to shake up our Adventist people when they see this? I mean, and from what I understand from you, Bob, the tactics that they are using against me to discredit me in this ministry and trying to crush what I am doing and to stop this material going out to our Adventist people and to diffuse it also is right out of the Roman papacy and right out of the tactics used by the Jesuits. Okay, first off, I want to ask you if you realized what you were getting into when you came here, and number two, how it plays into the whole scenario of Catholicism bringing the Seventh-day Adventist Church back into the fold and all the Protestant churches back to the mother church, and if this has been used in the past, and if it has anything, the tactics that are being used against this ministry and me have anything to do with the material that you have already shown us.
John, first of all, for the first question, I realize what I'm doing coming here. We're in a war.
Absolutely.
The devil is making war against the remnant. And I would like to get another book here.
Bob, go ahead and bring as many books as you need over. If we need to move some of these off, we will.
Well, first of all, John, the subject of rumor is an interesting one. In the Inquisition, popular rumor was used as the basis for apprehending people and dragging them into the Inquisition. The use of rumor and propaganda was used against Martin Luther. And I'd like to just bring you something from Daubigny's History of the Reformation.
Oh, Ellen White loved that book, didn't she?
Yes, she and James would read it for hours every Sabbath afternoon.
So they use these same tactics against Martin Luther. Well, that makes me feel better.
Well, here's the situation. You know, Staupitz introduced Luther to Christ.
Yes, right. He's the one that brought him into...
But now, as the heat came upon Martin Luther, something happened to Staupitz. Some of his friends seem inclined to retrace their steps. Staupitz, whom he designated his father, appeared shaken. The Pope had accused him, and Staupitz had declared his willingness to submit to the decision of His Holiness. "I fear," wrote Luther to him, "that by accepting the Pope for judge, you seem to reject me and the doctrines I have maintained. If Christ loves you, he will constrain you to recall your letter. Christ is condemned, stripped, and blasphemed. This is a time not to fear, but to raise the voice. For this reason, while you exhort me to be humble, I exhort you to be proud. For you have too much humility, as I have too much pride. The world may call me proud, covetous, an adulterer, a murderer, anti-pope, one who is guilty of every crime." So it all came in on him.
They accused him of all those things.
"What matters it, provided I am not reproached with having wickedly kept silence at the moment our Lord said with sorrow, I looked on my right hand and beheld, but there was no man that would know me. The word of Jesus Christ is a word not of peace, but of the sword. If you will not follow Jesus Christ, I will walk alone, will advance alone, and alone I will carry the fortress." And so Luther recognized that he was in a battle. They used propaganda warfare of rumor against him to try to destroy him. In fact, a lot of Daubigny is occupied with that. It's an old tactic. Go ahead, John.
Well, that is incredible that this man that was responsible for bending Martin Luther's early relationship with the Lord and establishing Martin Luther in the faith eventually turned against him, said he had gone too far, accused him of all these treacherous deeds, and went heading back towards Rome. Can I identify with that? Wow! I mean, that has happened to me. I mean, men who I fellowshipped with at one time and were very close to have now turned against me and accused me of the very things that they accused Martin Luther of, and have headed back towards Rome and say that I have gone too far. I'll have to be honest with you, I can really identify with that.
Well, John, another thing, Martin Luther was accused of dividing the church at the very time when it needed to be unified. The Turks were banging at the gates of Vienna. They had swept across North Africa and up into Spain. They were threatening the very existence of Christendom. And people came to Luther and they said, "What are you doing splitting the church with your doctrine at this very critical hour when we need church unity above all else?"
Boy.
And Martin Luther said, "Our safety lies in obedience to the Word."
Amen.
And you know, it was the same with the Waldenses. I have a tract at home in which the Roman Catholic Church accused the Waldenses of being opposed to church unity. And this is something very common. And here is an argument also which is used. Here was Miltitz who was trying to win Martin Luther over with a very kindly approach, with a very thoughtful and accommodating reproach to try to squelch the Reformation through kindness at the very beginning. "My dear Martin," said the Pope's Chamberlain in a fawning tone, "I thought you were an old theologian who, seated quietly at his fireside, was laboring under some theological crotchet. But I see you are still a young man and in the prime of life. Do you know," continued he, assuming a graver tone, "that you have drawn away everybody from the Pope and attached them to yourself?"
That's
Have you ever
exactly
heard
what they
that
accuse
argument?
me of. Exactly. You know, that I am some self-proclaimed Messiah that is supposed... Well, how ridiculous. Number one, I'm not self-proclaimed, and number two, I'm not setting myself up as an example. All I'm saying is get back to the Word. Get back to "Thus saith the Lord." Read and study for yourself. And using these tactics of slander. You were telling me earlier, Bob, that this is not only the tactics of modern warfare, and that we can go back for some time and explore that, but it's also incorporated by the Pentagon, by the CIA. How does all of this tie in? I would like to know.
I want to look at that in just a second.
Okay.
Here is, the nuncio went on saying that he had, believing that he had prepared Luther's mind, he continued in these terms, "Bind up the wound that you yourself have inflicted on the church, and that you alone can heal. Beware," said he, dropping a few tears, "beware of raising a tempest that would cause the destruction of Christendom."
Oh, the destruction of the church. We've got to do something. The Perth Declaration. And now that I've read about how that the conference presidents and union presidents are not happy with the Perth Declaration, and they even want them to put more bite and teeth into it, and call us by name and say what we are doing, and just really getting vehement against the independent ministries that are daring to reveal to our historic Adventist people what is really going on in the church.
John, it's interesting that Hitler understood the use of propaganda very powerfully. In fact, from the time of Marx and Engels on, in modern strategy, in the study of modern strategy, warfare is conceived of, first of all, as being diplomatic. That's like what the nuncio was doing with Luther. Diplomatic, ideological warfare, propaganda warfare, economic warfare, and military is only at the last resort. You can even look at the Kuwait War for that.
Sure.
But here's what Hitler said. He said, "The place of artillery preparation for frontal attack will in the future be taken by revolutionary propaganda," he explained. "In this way he would conquer the enemy's sight before his armies needed to fire their guns. How to achieve the moral breakdown of the enemy before the war has started, that is the problem that interests me." And so Hitler was interested in how to break down the moral defenses of the enemy by using propaganda, to wipe them out psychologically, to wipe them out morally. And here we have, published in Freedom's Ring in our last issue, our November-December issue, a course outline from the Pentagon that was used in training Latin American military officers on the utilization and containment of rumors. How to use rumor to destroy the enemy. And copies of this and other courses taught at the School of the Americas in the Panama Canal Zone have also appeared in the Jesuit magazine, Diálogo Social, published in Panama City. And so this is a course, and we have the outline here, in how to utilize rumor to destroy the enemy. One interesting formula in it is PR equals I times A. The power of the rumor, PR, equals I, the importance of the theme it refers to, times A, the ambiguity present. And so this the objective of the course is to teach the dynamic of the procedure for disseminating rumors. Now, we're looking at a tremendous artillery barrage. You know, at the end of World War II, the Russians, when they began their last assault against Germany, unleashed 1,000 artillery pieces at the same time, early one morning. And we're now in a tremendous artillery barrage of propaganda. It's not stopping now. It's going to continue. It's going to increase until God's people are made the objects of universal execration.
That's right.
We have to count the cost, like Jesus said, count the cost and see whether you're prepared.
And I want to tell you, this Perth Declaration is the first major barrage, salvo from the denominational leadership against the independent ministries. Really organized, calculated, orchestrated attack like these 1,000 pieces of artillery by the Germans at one time. This is their, and it's just the beginning, folks. It is just the beginning. They are starting the intense persecution on the independent ministries because we have dared to wake up the sleeping saints in God's church and show them the stuff that's been going on for years right under our nose, and nobody knew it. And praise God that He has raised up men like you to do the research to reveal to God's people what is going on. And I want to tell you, when our people see this research that you have done, Brother Bob, they've got to make either two choices, either for Protestantism or for Catholicism.
Exactly.
That's what it's all coming down to. You either accept Protestantism or you accept Catholicism. That's it.
That's it. And Protestantism comes down in the final analysis to the three angels' messages.
Absolutely, in verity.
You know, one of the methods of dissemination, according to this course, is the use of agents. And it says, friends in the affected region originate the rumor within the group, and they will create it by means of questions that insinuate their responses. And they will encourage sympathizers to disseminate stories and to distort them. And in a state of friendly confidence, they will spread the rumors.
Friendly confidence. Does that have anything to do with NLP? Getting a person on your side, pacing, mirroring, imaging, you know, all of these different techniques taught in NLP, how to get a person on your side, get into their mind, and work their mind around to your way of thinking, and get the...
It all fits together, John.
All fits together.
And what the devil is wanting to accomplish is to completely, with a knockout blow, nip in the bud the attempt at a revival of primitive godliness.
Exactly what Satan is trying to thwart.
That's what Satan is trying to do. That's the purpose of the celebration movement, the purpose of the charismatic movement, the false revival, the Catholic charismatic movement.
So many things are bursting on my consciousness as I talk with you. This sounds elementary, and I'm kind of afraid to say it, but this is the... And I guess I knew it all along, but maybe this is the first time that I've put it together and verbalized it to realize that the celebration movement totally negates the three angels' message, and the celebration movement has been organized and formulated to counteract the preaching of the three angels' message.
Absolutely. And John, thesis number 2 of the Jesuit strategy is that nothing may be rejected decisively and confessionally in one partner church which is binding dogma in another partner church. Do you understand that? That means that anything that the Roman Catholic Church holds cannot be decisively rejected in the world church to be by another group or entity. You cannot condemn Sunday keeping, you see, the Eucharist, any of that. That is all part of the strategy for the world church to be.
Bob, it's just dawning on me here. Something I've said in letters to our constituency for some time now, but now as I'm beginning to assimilate all of this information that you're giving us here, it's just becoming so clear that if we are going to preach the three angels' message to the world, the laity have got to do it. Our denomination and our leadership and our church is not going to preach the three angels message to the world. We quit doing that years ago. And if we are, and they are even, not only are they not going to preach the three angels message, they quit that years ago. But even if we're not going to preach it, they have now formulated a strategy to crush the preaching of the three angels message and to negate it. Not only are they not preaching it, but they have now brought in celebration, which totally strikes at the heart and does away with the preaching of the three angels message. So not only are they not going to preach it, but they don't want us, the laity, to preach it either. And that's what celebration is all about. And so what God's historic people, Adventist people, must do is get serious about formulating our own plans through the power of the Holy Spirit to preach the three angels message to the world. We're the ones that are going to have to do it. We are the ones whom God is calling to preach the three angels message to the world.
Exactly. And our weapon is the weapon of truth.
Absolutely.
And the Holy Spirit. We can only use the weapons of heaven. And if we start to use the weapons of the enemy, we move over into his camp. So it's so, practical godliness is so critical, and that we have the actual Spirit of Christ. Now, it's very interesting, in commenting on this thesis about no one condemning anything that's in another church, Karl Rahner says, and this is his reasoning, and it fits in exactly with what the Great Controversy says. He says that no one can depend anymore on his own study to form his conclusions and his worldview. Quote, as an individual, one becomes ever more impotent. One has to depend more and more on the knowledge of others, which one can no longer assimilate or check oneself. In other words, we have to depend on the ecclesiastical authorities, and he points out the holy office of the Inquisition, the sacred congregation for the doctrine of the faith, as being the only body that can approach to this kind of competence in dealing with this. Incidentally, John, as you were talking, I remembered that one of the strategies of Karl Rahner in his book is that the ecclesiastical leadership of each church is responsible for maintaining discipline in its own ranks along the drive toward union with Rome.
Maintaining discipline, getting rid of the dissidents and the ones who are divisive. And have you noticed that just in the last several years have they added the clause to their creedal document, the church manual, that gives another reason for church discipline, and that is being divisive. That was never part of the creed of the Seventh-day Adventist Church before until recently, because they wanted a way to disfellowship and get rid of the independent ministers.
That's all in canon law, John.
Absolutely.
It's right out of Roman Catholic.
Now explain to them what canon law is. Canon law is the Catholic article, the Catholic institution of law, this natural law, this Catholic law.
Let me get you a copy of it, John.
Okay. So canon law is Catholic law. And when I noticed, and people you need to make sure that people understand, because I know throughout Freedom's Ring you refer to canon law, and they need to understand that what you're referring to when you say canon law is Catholic law.
Oh, absolutely. This was promulgated by John Paul II in 1983, Code of Canon Law. And in this book, at the back you have the sequence for trials under canon law. Now that's a whole other subject, John, which I hope if we have time we can get into. The difference between Roman Catholic canon law and English common law and American constitutionalism. Our whole system of law that we have in America rests upon English common law, which battled against canon law in providing safeguards and guarantees for the people of England and then ultimately in America. For instance, under canon law you could be arrested in the middle of the night under suspicion because of rumor. The judge can make the decision to have you arrested himself. You can be arrested in the middle of the night. Your family don't know where you've gone. You're in prison. You can be judged by the judge in secret and put to death in secret. No one ever knows what happened to you.
That's what happened during the Dark Ages.
During the Dark
Roman
Ages,
papacy was in
yes.
control.
Now, under English common law, first of all, if someone comes and takes you away in the middle of the night, your wife can get a writ of habeas corpus to demand the jailer to show cause why you are in prison. Here's the body. You bring the body up out of the jail. Here is the reason he's in. And then the accusations have to be made in public by an accuser. The judge is impartial. There is a jury that decides, of your peers, that decides whether you are guilty or innocent. And then the impartial judge will mete out the sentence. And in our whole Bill of Rights, there is the defense against Roman Catholic canon law. Now that's why, with the new Supreme Court, which has been brought into position through the use of the abortion issue, and that's a whole other subject, John, we'll be here for days, the new judiciary and the new executive and legislative aspects of our government are all slanted now in a direction in which we are rolling back the clock and we are moving back to canon law. Even in decisions like Arizona versus Fulminati, the dissenting justices said, we have now, in this case, turned away from our accusatorial legal system and accepted the inquisitorial system, because now forced confessions can be accepted in court.
Okay, speaking of common law and canon law, which law was it that was followed when the Florida Conference disfellowshipped me and they told me that my invitation to appear before them was rescinded and that I was taken off of the agenda, and behind closed doors, behind my back, in secret, they disfellowshipped me from the Florida Conference of Seventh-day Adventists? Was that common law or canon law?
Well, it certainly wasn't common law. Basically, they followed step by step the canon law procedure for the removal of a pastor.
Now, what is that?
In your disfellowship.
The Catholic procedure for removing a pastor?
Right.
What is that? What is the agenda for that?
Well, we go through it here in the last issue of Freedom's Ring.
Does that have anything to do with the way that the Seventh Adventist Church leadership is now removing historic Adventist pastors from their leadership positions?
Not only that,
removing people from their church offices?
Exactly. Yes. In fact, in your case, it got to the point there at the end where they swept aside. And what I'm saying is they're paralleling it. Whether it's a conscious or unconscious thing, God only knows. They followed parallel the process, according to canon law, for the removal of a pastor in your disfellowshipping process. But at the end, as things intensified, they swept away even canon law and used what they had in the Inquisition, where there were no laws. And everything had to be swept away in the attempt to deal with the offender. And so he wouldn't get out of their grasp.
Does the situation now transpiring in Troy, Montana, have anything to do with canon law, to where they are now, the Montana Conference has informed the Troy Church that unless they disfellowship me, that they will disband their church?
Well, John, backing up a little bit to some of the earlier questions, canon law declares in Canon 1311, the church has an innate and proper right to coerce or force offending members of the Christian faithful by means of penal sanctions. And Canon 1312, number 2, says the law can establish other expiatory penalties which deprive a believer of some spiritual or temporal good and are consistent with the supernatural end of the church. Then Canon 1331, number 1, says an excommunicated person is forbidden, 1, to have any ministerial participation in celebrating the Eucharistic sacrifice or in any other ceremonies whatsoever of public worship. Number 3, to discharge any ecclesiastical offices, ministries, or functions whatsoever, or to place acts of governance. And then number 4, he cannot validly acquire a dignity, office, or other function in the church. Then in the area of controlling revenue, number 5, he cannot appropriate the revenues from any dignity. Have you noticed revenue is a big issue?
Oh, that's the big thing, of course.
Office.
That's why that tithe booklet was in the recent Adventist Review.
Any dignity, office, function, or pension in the church. Canon 1333, number 4, a suspension forbidding one to collect revenues, stipends, pensions, or any other such thing. And then there are punishments for violating unity, you see. Offenses against religion and the unity of the church. Canon 1364, number 1, with due regard for Canon 194, number 1, number 2, an apostate from the faith, a heretic, or a schismatic incurs automatic excommunication. So you see, if you are a heretic or a schismatic, you incur automatic excommunication. Number 2, if long-lasting contumacy, in other words, lack of submission, or the seriousness of scandal warrants it, other penalties can be added, including dismissal from the clerical state. Canon 1369, a person who uses a public show or speech, published writings, or other media of social communication to blaspheme, seriously damage good morals, express wrongs against religion or against the church, or stir up hatred or contempt against religion or the church, is to be punished with a just penalty. Now, it's interesting that the early Christians were called haters of the human race.
Yes.
Tacitus records that for us in his Annals. How the reason the people were burned for in the time of Nero was because the population regarded them as being haters of the human race. So what we're moving into at the end of time is a situation where the unregenerate mind is going to look upon the faithful as being haters and not going along with love and unity. Then there's a section on punishment for offenses against leadership. Title 2, offenses against ecclesiastical authorities and the freedom of the church. Canon 1371, the following are to be punished with a just penalty. Canon 1373, one who publicly either stirs up hostilities or hatred among subjects against the apostolic see or against an ordinary. An ordinary is a person who has been given direct office, such as a pastor or whatever, on account of some act of ecclesiastical power or ministry, or incites subjects to disobey them, is to be punished by an interdict or by other just penalties. Canon 1374, one who joins an association which plots against the church is to be punished with a just penalty. One who promotes or moderates such an association, however, is to be punished with an interdict. And
this is all canon law.
Yes.
Roman Catholic law.
And then, listen to Canon 1404.
Being followed by the Seventh Adventist Church in 1991.
Well,
to the letter.
The question you have to ask is, where does it say all these things in Scripture?
It doesn't, or in the spirit of prophecy.
If the Scripture is our norm for activity, where are all of these other things coming from?
Right out of Roman Catholic canon law.
Listen to this one, Canon 1404. The first see is judged by no one.
That's like
the Pope is
Robert
judged by no
Falkenberg.
one.
The Adventist Pope is judged by no one.
The manner of procedure in removing pastors, Canon 1740, when the ministry of any pastor has become detrimental, or at least ineffective for any reason, he can be removed from the parish by the diocesan bishop. Canon 1741, the reasons for which a pastor can be legitimately removed from his parish are especially the following. Number 1, a way of acting which is gravely detrimental or disturbing to the ecclesial community. So if a pastor acts in such a way that the rest of the ecclesiastical community is disturbed by him, that's justification for removing him from his parish.
Like showing all the pastors that have been trained in hypnosis.
Right, sure. Canon 1742. This canon requires the bishop to paternally persuade the pastor to resign the pastorate within a period of 15 days after he has explained for validity the reason and arguments for removal. Canon 1744, number 1, if the pastor hasn't answered within the aforementioned time period, the bishop is to repeat the invitation, extending the available time. Number 2, if the bishop has the proof that the pastor's received the second invitation but hasn't responded, and if the pastor refuses to sign, giving no reason, the bishop is to issue the decree of removal. Canon 1745, if the pastor opposes the cause alleged for removal and its reasons, the bishop is to, number 1, invite the pastor to organize his challenges to removal in a written report, having inspected the acts, and also to offer proofs to the contrary if he has any. Number 2, consider the matter with the same pastors in committee, that is. Number 3, determine whether or not the pastor must be removed and promptly issue a decree on the matter. Now, there was a decree, I think you're probably aware, John, that was issued regarding your disfellowshipping that went out across the nation. Canon 1747.
Okay, are you talking about telling them about it?
Yeah, telling them about it.
Yeah, they would.
Right.
They sent a fax and a letter to every conference president, and then the conference president sent it to the pastors, and the pastors read it from the pulpit.
Canon 1747, number 1, the removed pastor must abstain from exercising the office of pastor, vacate the rectory immediately, hand over all that pertains to the parish to the one to whom the bishop shall entrust the parish. Well, those are just a few of the canon
We're
laws.
following the Roman Catholic canon law to a T.
Well, what's going to happen, John, is in the New World Order, as Rome takes over, according to Revelation 17, I believe we're going to see the complete takeover of canon law replacing our Constitution. Ellen White says that every Republican and Protestant principle of our Constitution will be repudiated. And you can see, according to this, that anyone that speaks out against the Pope or in any way ruffles the thinking of the Roman Catholic Church will be subject to penalty.
As we are taping, this is the first week in December 1991. Have you seen in the news this week, Bob, about how that the Roman Catholic Church is getting so involved in this new world order, and how that everybody is looking to Pope John Paul to have a major role in this new world order? I mean, even the news media. I mean, I have seen it in the newspapers and on the newscast several times just this week, about the New World Order and the part that the Roman papacy and Pope John Paul II is playing in this.
Exactly. I mean, all the pieces of the puzzle are fitting together. Even, John, the Genocide Treaty, for example, and in our Constitution, under Article 6, number 2, any treaties that we make become the supreme law of the land, and this is designed to target anyone who promulgates hatred against a class or religion or a group of people. But hatred is in the eyes of the beholder. And just like the ancient Roman populace called the Christians the haters of the human race, yes, so the, quote, Christian world, which is really an apostasy at the end, will regard the true faithful ones as being haters of the human race, and they'll become subject under these laws.
But look, that goes all, I mean, I cannot help but think of Elijah when King Ahab said, "Thou that troubleth Israel." I mean, you know, the ones who have dared to speak out against the apostasy of leadership have always been accused of being the ones who bring all the trouble, and the haters of unity, and the haters of peace, and the haters of the human race, and all the troubles have been blamed on them because they dared to speak out against the apostasy. I mean, that's been going on for thousands of years.
It's going to happen on a massive scale. And we are
But are our people ready, Bob? Are our historic Adventist people ready for this stuff that's happening?
I don't think any of us are ready, John, but through the strength of the Lord, the weak can become as David.
I am fearful for our people. I'm fearful for our people. Our people are calling, you know, we have 6 nationwide Watts lines that used to be just good in the United States. Well, now we have 1-800-HIS-LOVE that's good in all of Canada. You know, almost all of North America now, 1-800-HIS-LOVE. And our Adventist people are calling from all over North America, Alaska, Hawaii, Canada, all the provinces, and even Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and calling us, and our staff are just on the phone. I mean, you know, just yesterday, our switchboard operator was just absolutely exhausted by the time 5 o'clock. She was just absolutely exhausted. Bless her heart. Linda just said, "Pastor John," she says, "almost all 6 lines have been lit up all day." Mm-hmm. You know, it just seems that is almost all we do. Mm-hmm. And our Adventist people are just calling and just pleading for help, and telling the things that their pastor has said, stuff their pastor's putting up on the bulletin board about us, the tremendous slander and rumor that is being promulgated from the conference to the pastors, and the pastors to the church members about us. And it just seems that our people cannot withstand the onslaught that is being brought against them by the leadership. And I'm fearful, Bob, I'm fearful for our historic Adventist people. I really don't believe that they or any of us are ready for this tremendous Catholic onslaught that is coming to us through our leadership.
Absolutely. You know, Alvin Toffler, the renowned social thinker who wrote the book Power Shift, says in that, and I think it's a word of wisdom, we see all these blips of information that come by, little scraps of this and pieces of that, and it's too much to try to deal with every blip. But if we can look at the picture strategically, and that's what we're wanting to do here today.
Amen.
What is the strategy? What is God's strategy at the end of time? What is Babylon's strategy? And what we're doing is we're looking at the sources of Babylon to see what their strategy is, and it fits in exactly with what God told us the strategy would be. And when we can deal with it, and we can cope with it much better when we see the whole picture, the strategy, and how all these pieces all fit together. and what we're dealing with. We are in the last days, John. Amen. We are in Revelation 12:17 Amen. Right now.
Encountered at Southern College. Exactly. Yeah. You know, I had been there my freshman year in 1970, but then I went my sophomore and junior year to La Sierra, but then I had dropped out because I had become disillusioned. But when the Lord called me distinctively into the ministry and I went back to Southern College in 1979, this is exactly what I found at Southern College. And I would find myself at odds with my entire theology class and professor, defending 1844, Day for a Year, the Heavenly Sanctuary, Character Perfection, Ellen White, our cardinal doctrines. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe the things that were happening. And to find out that the same exact thing happened to you in our colleges.
Well, John, I took a break then and went and worked with my dad's medical practice, giving Bible studies. We remodeled a number of houses for finances. We were on deferred appointment to Africa. And the conference ultimately offered me a district, but at that time I needed to go back and finish up my MDiv. And I ultimately went on for my MTH and basically took the bulk of the classwork was doctoral work. And about the time I began my thesis for the MTH, I went back in the field, and I've been so busy ever since. And I was a college teacher. But in that break, at the end...
You were a college teacher. So you've also taught on the college level, too.
Oh, yes. In fact, I taught virtually every undergraduate course that is usually taught, including some that aren't usually taught, like Biblical Aramaic.
How did you get to the mindset where you are today? How did you get in the groove of historic Adventism and come out of all of this stuff? That's what people ask me. John, how did you go through our educational system and get to where you are today? And I want to ask you that question now.
Well, I knew it would be a battle at the seminary, and particularly after our first stint. When we went back the second time, I guarded, first of all, very carefully the communion with God. I had prayer walks in the morning, in the evening. I took my family for prayer walks morning and evening. There were families breaking up around us. There were faculty families breaking up. There were fellows selling their Spirit of Prophecy books, leaving the ministry, leaving the faith, all of that type of thing. And I devoted a certain segment of each day specifically for answering the questions that had arisen in my own mind as a result of doubts that had been raised in classes. I had one class that was so subtly satanic that I had to spend 2 hours each time after that class, after virtually every class period, in communion with the Lord to get rid of the evil spirit that haunted me after being in that class.
Sometimes in my classes at Southern College, I would find myself weeping because I found my theology being rearranged, and I found my mind being rearranged and twisted by, trying to take on one student, trying to take on the entire theology class and professors. That's awesome, Bob. Yet I found that day after day after day, and it got to the place where I didn't want to go to class anymore because I found out that defending historic Adventism made me an outcast.
It didn't jibe with the book Great Controversy. It didn't jibe with the three angels' messages.
What didn't jibe? What they were saying?
The whole cast of the approach at the seminary bothered me. The approach toward Rome was very significant. Yeah. Here, I cut my teeth on
Great Controversy.
Great Controversy.
Amen.
And it didn't square up. It didn't square up with what I had taught. In fact, I had a class there right after I came back from Africa in which we had outright ecumenical books. One was by James F. White, New Forms of Worship, where it advocated dancing, hiring professional dancers to dance on the stage for worship.
This is at seminary at Andrews.
And recommended beyond that even having the congregations dance.
And then our people wonder why our preachers are the way they are today. And those with white hair in the Adventist church say, the things we're hearing from the pulpits today don't match what we heard 30, 40 years ago, and they have a hard time understanding why there's been this big shift. It's because our ministry has been trained in ecumenicalism.
Not only that, it started long before that in the educational system, as you know,
Absolutely.
John. There was one very dedicated professor there at the seminary who sometimes had to fast for days before he approached certain subjects because of the hostility of the fellows who had been trained in our colleges. They come into this with it fastened on them early on. Anyway, in this particular class, I had to critique the book, and I said, of course, well, this man had even recommended, he said, we are past the literary era, and so we need to use banners of love and peace, and we're beyond the stage where people will read the Bible and that type of thing. So I said, of course, this man is an ecumenical, and we cannot go along with what he's saying. We have to find our principles of worship in the Word of God and the Spirit of prophecy. The professor was furious. He came into class with the sheaf of analyses that the students had done, and he built up as he was reading them, finally got to mine at the end, and he said, "Brethren, ecumenism is not a dirty word," and his face was just flushed with anger. He took excerpts from my paper and twisted them out of context. And a couple of weeks later, he called me into his office, and he asked me the question. He said, "Are you an American?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Have you been a lifelong Adventist?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Are your parents Adventists?" And I said, "Yes." He's in questions like this, and finally he said to me, "I noticed you came down hard on the book we had for class." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Now, if this man was sitting here in this chair, don't you think we ought to talk to him?" Of course, meaning ecumenical,
Sure.
but I took it in a little different vein, and I said I'd be happy to talk to the man, but I said as far as his book goes, it was directly contrary to the first angel's message. And the professor's mouth metaphorically dropped open, and I got up and walked out of the office. But this is the kind of thing you encounter, you know.
This is exactly what
God's appointed time for meeting with the youth. And I would jump on my cycle and go out and be there when the sun rose, and be up in the hills when the sun set, just worshiping God. It was the most thrilling experience. And those rides out in the mountain, it was an Enoch type of experience. I was 19 years old, and, you know, the ages around that, and I just reveled in the freedom and the communion with God. To me, it was the greatest thing in the world to be able to commune with the Creator.
Amen. Well, what started happening when you were in college that helped you to realize that things were not on course as far as we as a Seventh-day Adventist? You mentioned to me earlier that you started to realize that in 20 years things were going to be drastically different, because our colleagues, the age group that you and I went to school with, are now in leadership positions in the church, and you realized that then, and you said in 20 years there's going to be a terrible upheaval in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because these are the church administrators being trained right now. What was that, in the 70s?
Late 60s,
early 70s? Has that been true? Was that
Absolutely.
prophetic, Bob?
Absolutely. As I looked around me, I knew there was a titanic struggle. And John, this issue goes far beyond just theology, which is very critical. It goes into the very core of our experience. With the fear of the Lord, are we going to surrender and submit to the Lord, or are we going to imbibe of these things? Yes. And as I looked around, I said to myself, in 20 years, we're going to see upheavals in this church like you wouldn't believe.
You said earlier, I appreciate so much, Bob, your honesty and forthrightness. And you admitted to me, you said, "John, I've got to be honest and truthful with you, that I got caught up in the Ford heresy." Tell us about that.
Well, after I did a stint in Africa under the Adventist Volunteer Service Corps, teaching college and academy right out of the Bible, incidentally, in the spirit of prophecy. It was a tremendous experience. And I had a good, excellent Bible teacher in college who comprehended the great controversy issues. That was very meaningful to me. And I came back and I attended the seminary. I was very shocked by the ecumenical stance of the seminary. I will say this, there are some good men there, but the overall cast is an ecumenical type of cast and network.
I found the same thing to be true in my theological training.
It was very disturbing. There is, of course, new theology being taught there. We know that 2020 Vision now is being used.
Yes.
And whole departments are in that category.
How did you get sucked up into this Ford thing, though, Bob?
What happened was, after 5 quarters at the seminary, I went to my wife and I.
This is Andrews, yeah.
Right. I knew I had to answer some of these questions. Even after having studied the spirit of prophecy in the Bible for hours, every day for years, it was so disturbing to me, the things that I encountered, that I knew I needed time to answer these questions for myself.
Was it the situation with the heavenly sanctuary, the things they were twisting concerning that? That's what I found when I was at Southern Missionary College.
It was, with me, it was, I always have loved the influence of the Spirit of God coming through the Word as well as the natural world. And as a boy, I was keenly aware about the Second Advent. I had a picture of it in my bedroom, and I remember even praying to the Lord that the Lord would somehow give me a dream of what it might be like at the Second Advent. And I was keenly aware also about end-time events. I suppose it was about at the age of 11 that I picked up the Great Controversy, not this one, but I was so astounded by what I read. It gripped my heart like I think probably nothing I had ever read had gripped it. And I wondered, why am I not hearing these things in sermons? And this is absolutely fascinating, and my heart was just charmed by the story of the Reformation and Luther and the Waldenses. And ever since then, whenever I've been able to obtain old books on the subject of historical theology, I've gotten a hold of them, read them. I love D'Aubigné's History of the Reformation that Ellen and James White would read by the hour Sabbath afternoons. And as I went on through my educational experience in academy and then in college, I felt a deepening hungering for the Lord. And I got to the point in college where I would be spending 3 and 4 hours a day studying the Bible in the spirit of prophecy.
Amen.
I had a Honda Trail 90, and I loved to go up into the North Georgia mountains, the mountains of Tennessee, where the sparkling lakes and the rivers and waterfalls, and commune with the Lord.
Now, did you go to college at Southern Missionary College?
Right.
That's where I was.
I went there as well as at Atlantic Union College.
Yes, yes.
Came through our educational system except for when I was in kindergarten and first grade, was public school.
So you were born and raised a Seventh-day Adventist and came up through our educational system just like I did. I got to ask you, how old are you, Bob?
42.
42. You beat me by 2 years. I just turned 40. So we come from the same generation. I think that's obvious.
That's right.
Both born and raised in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, what happened in your college years? You gave me a little hint of that earlier.
You know, John, that's an interesting point you make. We're both of the same generation, same vintage, and we have seen the complete turning inside out of our movement.
You can say that.
And that has concerned both of us and led us to do what we're doing. But your question was, what did I see in college that stimulated and concerned me?
Yes.
Well, in the college dorm, you could walk from one end of the dorm to the other, 400 fellows, and not miss one word of the main rock station in Chattanooga.
Oh, you found that to be true in your dorm too, huh?
It was so bad. There was a young student, a doctor's son there, who was 16 years old, and he came one day to my room and he said, "Bob, I am losing my mind here." The intense worldliness, doors open with the music just pouring through the hallways, no relief.
Right.
So I said to him, "I have the answer for you." And I said, "You come with me." And we hopped on my Trail 90, and 1 hour in the mountains, he was just fine. But it was during that time that I read the statement of the Spirit of Prophecy that the hours of sunrise and sunset are...
Bob Trefz, so good to have you here. I've been reading your magazine, Freedom's Ring, for some time now, and I want to tell you that God has raised you up, brother, for such a time as this. I know you have a lot to tell us, and before we get into it, let's ask God's Holy Spirit to be with us, because I want to tell you, from what I have already heard, you have a tremendous wealth of knowledge to share with us. So let's ask God's Holy Spirit to be with us right now. Will you kneel with me? Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you will be with my brother Bob Trefz. Dear Father, I thank you for raising him up for such a critical time as this in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Touch his lips with a hot coal from thine altar now, dear Father, as he brings to us the revelations that he has found happening not only in the world but in the church, and how it leads to end-time prophecy. To thy name's honor and glory, we dedicate this video in the holy and blessed name of Jesus and for his sake. Amen.
Amen.
Bob, when I was on vacation recently, I took this bound volume of Freedom's Ring that you sent me, and I went through it with a highlighter pen, and I want to tell you, brother, it's been a long time since I have seen any document that has shaken me like this material that you have put together. The Lord has given you a knowledge and a insight into what is happening within our church. And what we want to do on this video is just to let you talk and to reveal to God's people the things that you have uncovered and put it on video for God's historic Adventist people to realize where we are in this church and in this earth's history. Before we get into this, though, I would like to know, and I think the Adventist people watching this video would like to know also, what your history has been. I've got to be perfectly honest with you. A year ago, I'd never heard of Bob Trefz. I didn't know who you were, and suddenly I see this Freedom's Ring everywhere and all this wonderful material and people talking about the material that you have brought out. Give us a little bit of your history. Have you been a Seventh-day Adventist all your life? Have you been through our educational system? How did Freedom's Ring come into existence? Give us an update. How did you get where you are now, Bob?
First of all, John, I'd like to say it's really wonderful to be with you. We've enjoyed our experience here, and we feel that we owe you a real debt for the work that you've done with your celebration series. It has awakened the church like nothing else has, and it's a real honor to be here with you. I'm a third-generation Adventist, John, and I grew up loving the Lord, had godly parents. I spent a lot of time hiking out in nature as a boy and teenager, and I still do.